Welcome all. I appreciate your participation in today's event. My name is Denny Groh, President of ITPA NCC. Today is our second Cybersecurity Transformation Summit, and what an exciting and meaningful lineup we have for today. First order of business today, in true ITPA style, is the passing of the gavel to ITPA's new president. As your president this past year, it's been my honor and distinct privilege to serve this great organization and the community. And now I'm pleased to pass the gavel to our incoming ITPA president, Thelma Barker. Please join me in a warm round of applause for Thelma Barker.
Thank you, Denny. I want to extend ITPA's and my heartfelt thanks and gratitude to you for your strong leadership, your years of dedication to ITPA, and your many contributions to this great organization. You have set a high standard of excellence for ITPA, and I look forward to building upon your many successes. As mentioned, for today's audience, we extend our warmest welcome and appreciation to you for joining us today for our Cybersecurity Transformation Summit. ITPA proudly presents this second in a series session today in collaboration with Electrosoft Services, Inc. Today's 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. jam-packed session will address federal government challenges for cybersecurity technologies and policies for mitigating current and future to an ever-expanding IT networks and mobile infrastructure environment. A little bit about ITPA NCC. The Independent Telecommunications Pioneer Association is a nonprofit professional association created by and for the telecommunications industry. Dedicated to community service, ITPA has been serving the public on behalf of telecom companies since 1920. Today's session is part of ITPA's ongoing and popular series of information exchange sessions, from in-person lunches to now virtual sessions. In the spirit of giving back, ITPA is honored to support the Capital Area Food Bank, the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, and the USO. ITPA NCC is thrilled to recognize the contributions and support of Avaya Government Solutions, BT, CenturyLink Government, Corning, Crown Castle, Graybar, and Mettel. And now, I'm pleased to introduce our colleague and collaborator, Manuel Miranda, President, Electrosoft Services, Inc. He recently joined the Electrosoft team and brings over 30 years of experience to the role. Earlier, he served as COO of InfoZen and has served in senior leadership roles at several technology companies with experience growing and scaling companies, a thought leader and a key player in the cyberspace. Please join me in welcoming Electrosoft's Manuel Miranda.
Thank you, Thelma, and congratulations to you on your new role at ITPA NCC. Electrosoft is pleased to collaborate with ITPA on this special second in the series Cyber Summit. I'm thrilled to be part of this special joint event. As a federal government contractor, Electrosoft delivers a diverse set of technology-based solutions and with services and a strong focus on cybersecurity. We're based in Reston, Virginia. Electrosoft has had the pleasure of supporting a wide variety of federal agency customers through an array of contract vehicles. To set the stage for the second Cybersecurity Transformation Summit, I offer a look at the growing challenges in cybersecurity and the need to address it with both infusion of new technology and infusion of new cybersecurity professionals. As we all know, cybersecurity is affected by the amount of data that's coming in and the variety of data and the different systems that it comes through. We know that the data has been growing at a phenomenal rate. Today, some people say there's 44 zettabytes of data. Each zettabyte is 1 billion terabytes, so it's a very large number. With technology getting faster and cheaper and increased bandwidth like 5G, data growth is only accelerating. And COVID, almost overnight, reversed office versus home for all of us data users. There is no going back. Even in the post-COVID days, it will not be like the pre-COVID days because there'll be a new blend of home office mix. Many companies have seen that they suffered very little, if no, degradation in productivity from homebound employees. And employees saw the benefits of a better home balance. The general growth of data will also continue in part because people really are demanding an unlimited access to data everywhere. That's not stopping. Artificial intelligence certainly is a new technology that it could be an answer for the growing demands. AI is part of the full blend of automation, but AI's technology hasn't been fully realized, nor has the dangers of AI been fully realized at the battlefront of cybersecurity. Automation, as we said, is a force multiplier for our current workforce. It allows an increased productivity by many folds. But even with all this new technology, we're still going to need new cybersecurity professionals. There's an ever-growing shortage of cybersecurity professionals, actually. And in 2019, there were over 300,000 cybersecurity positions left open. And some say by 2021, that number is going to reach over 500,000. And worldwide, the number of openings that are left open is 3 to 4 million. So the shortage is here to stay. So we have to reinvent the way training is done. The growing shortage has to make us rethink beyond the 4-year degree programs and to produce the new cybersecurity workforce for the future. We must reinvent training, which actually has already started with the growing number of academies and boot camps throughout the United States that are training a new workforce in 3 to 4 months. Also, we need to increase the introduction of vocational cybersecurity training programs in high schools. We need to get them at a young age. But we also need to increase the candidate population. For example, women are a little over 50% of the population, yet they only fill 20% of the cybersecurity positions. Finally, we have to align the new paradigm of training with the job qualifications. No longer can we keep every single position at a requirement of a 4-year degree if our new workforce is coming through this new way of training. So I strongly believe with the infusion of both new technology and an ever-expanding workforce that we can meet the growing challenges of the future. Regarding today's second joint virtual Cyber Summit, we extend our sincere thanks to our generous sponsors, Aclavio Federal, Comcast Business, CommScope, Signacom Solutions, and Foxhole Technologies. We acknowledge their contributions and express our appreciation for their support. And now, back to you, Thelma.
Thank you, Manuel. And now, a few quick housekeeping items. We welcome our friends and colleagues from the media. As a reminder, today's sessions are all on the record. If you have a question, simply open the Q&A tab on your webinar toolbar and type in your question. I, as the MC, along with the panel moderator, Nicole Johnson, will work to include your questions throughout the sessions. If you're having any technical difficulties, use the chat box in your toolbar to chat with the webinar host. We have also included a very brief survey to capture your feedback on the webinar and to help us to continually improve. We appreciate it if you would take a few moments at the end of today's webinar to complete the survey. The link will be available for your viewing pleasure following today's webinar. And now, without further ado, it is indeed my privilege to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Daniel Cruz. He is the Deputy Assistant Director at CISA, National Risk Management Center, focusing on strategic engagement. Earlier at CISA, he led and planned for this first of its kind DHS National Cybersecurity Summit that has been known widely as a groundbreaking moment for enhanced collaboration between the public and private sectors on cybersecurity risk management. Please join me in a warm Electrosoft ITPA welcome to our exciting opening keynote speaker, Daniel Cruz.
Well, Thelma, thank you for the introduction and good morning, everyone. And first of all, congratulations on assuming your new leadership role at ITPA here, which is very exciting. And I think you described the next 3 hours as being jam-packed. So privileged to be able to kick off the jam-packed discussion here for the next few hours. As Thelma mentioned, I'm the Acting Deputy Assistant Director at the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, focused on a lot of our risk management efforts for the critical infrastructure community. Cybersecurity risk management being a huge part of that. And I think when I look at the vantage point from the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency compared to the summit title today, Cyber Transformation, really have a unique perspective here to share some thoughts about how this landscape and how this ecosystem is changing and how we can all be part of the collective defense mission together. I think both those words, the cyber and the transformation, are both key and operative when we talk about the shifts that we're seeing here going forward. On the cyber front, it's no secret that in an increasingly digitally connected world, the threat landscape is rapidly evolving, and we all must lean in to be more vigilant against cyber adversaries right now. And at the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, we play a role there as the lead civilian cyber agency. We offer assessments to your network, cyber hygiene scans. We have information sharing programs, a suite of capacity building that we offer to organizations. And so on the cyber side, we very much have matured our capabilities and our offerings around the ability of a whole range of stakeholders to better understand the vulnerabilities in cyberspace and how their organizations can ensure they're protected against those. And in fact, we've seen, and it's never something you want to pat yourself on the back for, because it's just reinforcement of the threat landscape. We've seen just in the last few months here, we have put out alerts here at CISA about a series of vulnerabilities that we score 10 out of 10 on the CVSS and Common Vulnerability Scoring System in terms of just the amount of potential damage they could do if exploited. And just in the last few weeks here, there was we put out an alert about a wormable vulnerability in an SAP NetWeaver application. And then even more recently, a few days ago, there was a Windows DNS server remote code execution vulnerability. All of those 10 out of 10 on the CVSS score. So that just highlights that it's literally day by day here in terms of what we're keeping track of, to work with all of our partners, many on the phone here today, to ensure that collectively we have the threat awareness. But that being said, I would also be the first to tell you that when we look at the world of cybersecurity risk management right now, obviously paying attention to those alerts I just mentioned about some of these high profile vulnerabilities and taking the right remediation action, of course, that is vitally important, and all organizations should do that. That's basic hygiene and capacity building. But the state of cybersecurity risk management right now is about so much more than just sort of quote unquote patching your stuff. And that's where I think we're starting to see a big trend right now. That's baseline expectation capacity building. And that's where when I sort of look at the title of today's summit, the cyber and the transformation, that's where we sort of get to the transformation piece. We have seen a significant tectonic shift in the landscape of stakeholders and the interconnectedness of our critical infrastructure community right now. And so the basic cyber blocking and tackling, the cyber hygiene, the vulnerability management, that is of course important. That is the baseline. But the transformation that we're seeing right now is what I think really demands a whole of society and whole of government approach going forward. CISA sits in a really unique perspective here. We have a broad mission as the nation's lead cybersecurity agency, but it kind of falls into two main buckets. One is that we've got a .gov network protection mission. And so many of you are probably familiar with programs like Einstein and CDM, which work across the civilian.gov to secure federal networks, which is of course important. The second, which I focus more on, is our critical infrastructure security and resilience mission. And so we sit on top of 16 critical infrastructure sectors: financial services, energy, health and public health, water and wastewater, oil and natural gas, things like that. And we sit on top of them and are able to aggregate all sorts of different pieces of situational awareness and threat information to stitch together a holistic cyber risk picture for the nation. And we've really seen a lot of shifts in this landscape. And in that perch, we're fortunate to be able to look across sort of left to right across a wide critical infrastructure community. And what that visibility has shown us is that this is no longer just about one company or one network. A really static asset organization worldview is no longer going to give you the holistic risk picture to fully understand the threat landscape. And we've seen all sorts of silos broken down in terms of, if you look at the connectedness and interconnectedness and dependencies and interdependencies within and across traditional sectors and industry verticals, it's really hard to look at cyber risk in silos right now. And so we've really seen it's become increasingly hard to disaggregate the disciplines of cybersecurity risk management, supply chain risk management, and critical infrastructure protection. They're all now just sort of intertwined layers on top of each other that you have to deal with in concert. And so that's been a real shift for us over the last few years as we built upon our existing cyber capability in the vulnerability management and in the capacity building and assessment space, and really had to layer on this complicated, interconnected understanding of how the nation's connected infrastructure operates and where are those pinch points and single points of failure and potential opportunities for cascading impact if we're not safe. And so there's a lot of shifts in that space. I think central to all that is this notion that there's an enormous amount of commonality of attack surface right now. And you hear that thrown out a lot. Well, what does that mean? I think if you look at the universe of information and communications technology, ICT, which you frequently hear, the hardware, software, and services, sort of the building blocks of the connected world, if you will. So you've got ICT in one hand, and then on the more operationally focused hand, you've got a bunch of ICS, industrial control systems, which are increasingly digitally connected as well. So they're no longer fully air-gapped offline, they have some connectivity. And there's a lot of commonality of attack surface across those connected underpinning building blocks of our digital infrastructure right now. And so that just sort of increases the need to be extraordinarily vigilant, not just against the threat landscape and the vulnerabilities we face, but it gets better understanding how this web of infrastructure, all connected and interdependent in some way, all underpinned by a relatively common set of hardware, software, and services and other connected industrial componentry, where the risk truly lies there. And that's been an area where we have really continued to lean in, recognizing that cyber adversaries right now, they are looking for that commonality of attack surface to really exploit us and to find ways to cause maximum pain if they can. And a really top of mind example there, if you go back a year and a half or so, you may have seen in the news something called APT-10 Cloud Hopper. This was Advanced Persistent Threat 10 Cloud Hopper vulnerability. This was an exploit and a campaign, a strategic campaign by Chinese-based hackers, state-sponsored hackers, that compromised a series of managed service providers and cloud service providers to extract maximum digital pain by exfiltrating untold amount of intellectual property across dozens of industries in the United States and across dozens of other countries as well. And I think the point there isn't just that there was a cyber incident and a bunch of data was exfiltrated. It was the marrying together the components of what all that means. It means, one, the adversary was acting in a highly strategic way. This was not just a quick hitting, opportunistic, let's compromise some vulnerable equities to get some Bitcoin like we've seen in other actors. This was playing a multi-decade long game of how can we have industrial policy catch up over the course of decades by exfiltrating intellectual property from the United States and other countries around the world. So the strategic nature and intent of the adversary there was extraordinarily important to understand. In line with that, then think about how they did it. They were looking for and I just talked about the commonality of the attack surface and how that makes us have to sort of rethink this interconnected infrastructure world. The adversary here was looking for points of leverage they could extract to cause maximum pain. Why just pop one organization or one company or go for one sector when you can kind of find these aggregating layers on top that have the ability to reach in to all of those? And so to me, that's really the telling part about APT10 Cloud Hopper, which was a Chinese state-backed campaign, is that they didn't just find ways to strategically go after the United States, our companies, our intellectual property, and other allies. They did it in the most efficient, scalable way possible. And that's really a good segue to recognizing, and I mentioned earlier sort of how supply chain risk management and cybersecurity risk management are now inexorably linked. One of the reasons they're inexorably linked, and to this Cloud Hopper example I just gave, is you've got third-party risk is now a foundational part of understanding cybersecurity risk management. And supply chain risk management has gone in the last 3 years from kind of being a peripheral conversation in a lot of cyber circles to now front and center, sort of in line with the reality of the APT10 Cloud Hopper example that I just gave. So then the question kind of becomes, well, where did this big acceleration and amplification of our awareness and need to better understand supply chain and third-party risk, where did this start? And I don't think there's a demarcation line in the sand necessarily, but for the Department of Homeland Security and my agency, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, I think really where for us, this became something that was a daily part of our mission was probably, let's walk back to the fall of 2017, when we issued a binding operational directive on Kaspersky Labs antivirus software. And this binding operational directive, this is an authority that we take seriously, that we have as the department ability to promulgate security directives to other executive branch agencies. And what we did is we told them that you have 90 days to take Kaspersky Lab antivirus software out of your network. And we made that decision because we had reached a very defensible and risk-based judgment that posed an undue risk to the integrity of our networks and our national security to allow this software and the connection that software had to its manufacturer on the networks of the US government. And I think it's a good success story in terms of within 90 days, there was almost full compliance, and we were able to use that policy lever we had to make federal networks incrementally safer, which I think is a good news story. But the biggest takeaway from that is the fact that there was enormous litigation around the Kaspersky Labs binding operational directive, where Kaspersky Labs was accusing the US government of being arbitrary and capricious in the way that it made that decision. And so we had to establish, we had to present that risk-based judgment in a whole bunch of judicial proceedings. And so as we were organizing those thoughts for the courts, we really saw that the methodical process we took arriving to that decision, to make that justified risk-based decision to remove Kaspersky Labs, we really had built unknowingly perhaps, the foundation of third-party trust and assurance supply chain risk management doctrine or framework, if you will. And there were 3 key parts of that. And the first was a technical perspective. If you can make a defensible risk-based argument that from a technical perspective, the product, the hardware, the software, the services, that it's just too risky, it poses an undue risk, then that's a really easy, clean argument right there. And so we went into great length talking about how the antivirus software, before you even talk about the name of the manufacturer or the country the manufacturer is in, it's just a leaky, bad product. And so that was number one. So we just talked at a very technical perspective about the product. And then two, we talked about the characteristics of the country of origins. Before we even mentioned the name Russia, we walked through a whole set of characteristics where if manufacturers are based in countries that have these things in terms of an independent judiciary and adequate privacy controls and due process and things like that, that makes us more comfortable with the manufacturer in those countries. And if the manufacturer is in a country that doesn't have those things, then we start to have some serious concern. And so we're able to lay out a set of characteristics. It wasn't just a good or bad list of countries necessarily. Before we even got to that point, it was laying out a set of characteristics around trust. And so that was number two. Number one was the technical specifications of the product. And then number two was around the characteristics of trust in a government that the manufacturer of that product may be domiciled in. And then number three was relational. It was about what is the relationship between the leadership of the manufacturer of the hardware, software, and service and the leadership of the country that they're domiciled in. And we were able to make a very defensible, risk-based judgment around an uncomfortably cozy relationship between the leadership of Kaspersky Labs and the Russian government, in particular ties to sort of military and intelligence components of that country. And so that was kind of our 1, 2, 3 argument that we were able to lay out about why we felt, and it was justified in the name of national security for the United States, to make that decision. And so while it was the 90-day process was obviously worthwhile in terms of pulling that lever and taking down what we believe firmly was a risky product from Federal Networks, the ensuing litigation was a really interesting reinforcement of how the underpinning argument we had laid out in those 3 buckets and how defensible it was. And ultimately, the DC Circuit Court of Appeals in a 3-year decision said, yes, you are correct. We agree with your argument and the national security argument that you have laid out. So that was, I think, really reinforcing to us about the validity of sort of laying out that risk-based case and how that can be a good driver of national security. I think it's really interesting, something else that came out of that decision. And I was having a conversation with the CISO of a quite large American city recently. He said, hey, I have been wanting to take Kaspersky Labs off my networks, of my city networks, for some time. And I just didn't feel like I had the top cover. I felt like I was opening myself up to civil litigation, of potentially being sued for being arbitrary or capricious or trying to wade into global geopolitics, as opposed to just kind of doing my technical job as a CISO. And he was saying, I really wanted to make that decision. I couldn't until you all, the US government, gave us that top cover. Once you made that decision and then it went through the litigation process and your risk judgments were validated, that was the North Star that I needed to be able to point to and say, no, I'm doing this because if that product, that software, that service, if it's bad for the national security and federal networks, then I think it poses a risk to my city networks as well. And so that was a really telling moment for me and kind of humbling and empowering, to be honest, because it said that that North Star that we put up, aside from the discrete action of what we were able to action on federal networks, that North Star that we put up with defensible underlying risk judgments beneath it, that other people pay notice to that. And that really got me thinking about, we always talk about how cybersecurity is a team sport, and it takes the executive branch and it takes Capitol Hill and industry stakeholders and third-party and security researchers and academia, all of them coming together. And as someone who currently works for the government, it got me thinking of, well, what is the thing that government uniquely can do and add value to? Because that was a really nice example for me of reinforcement from a stakeholder in the state and local community of saying, that was a place where you and only you alone could add that value, and we needed that. And so that was really helpful because there's the threat landscape being what it is, duplication of effort is never helpful. And so to the extent you can needle in on, well, what are the areas where we can uniquely add value, and then where can we partner with others in different areas, I think that's going to help us get to the spot we want to be. And so I think that's a good segue for me to sort of highlight, with that in mind, where can the US government, where can my agency, CISA, add unique value going forward? I think we've got some exciting things on the horizon here over the coming months. And one area we're going to try to continue to mature our understanding of, but of course working with partners, is continue to connect vulnerability management with risk management. And on the surface, those may sound like sort of the same thing. And I mentioned the SAP and then the Windows vulnerabilities earlier, as vulnerability management will continue to be a core part of basic cyber hygiene and best network practices. But in a world where we are seemingly swimming in vulnerabilities, how do we understand the connection between remediation of vulnerabilities and risk management outcomes, not just for companies and organizations, but since everything is interconnected, for the larger critical infrastructure community in the nation? And so I don't think we're going to get to sort of a scientific decimal place quantification of that, but I think this is an area that's really ripe for continued engagement of maturing the study and the discipline of connecting cyber vulnerability management with cyber risk management outcomes. And so that's an area I think you'll see us continue to focus on over the coming year or so here. And core to that is the ability to add some metrics to cyber loss. And this has been a really vexing problem that I think will continue to be sort of a whole of community and whole of critical infrastructure community effort going forward. One of the reasons it has been difficult to sort of definitively connect vulnerability management with cyber risk management, it's been a very imperfect science, for no fault of anyone, of quantifying cyber loss. You know, there are some very direct losses from cyber incidents. You know, the actual money you have to spend on remediation or reconstitution of your networks. And then perhaps if there's a fine from the breach or some sort of civil penalty, obviously that's quite easy to quantify. But then there are other things that are much harder to quantify. What is the true cost of intellectual property that's exfiltrated? Recognizing we might not realize that loss for decades in some instances, as I was talking about that Chinese APT10 issue earlier. And then reputational risk, how do you quantify that? And so I think we'll continue to see a maturation of the science and the discipline of how we quantify cyber loss, recognizing that some of those buckets are going to be easier to understand and some are always going to be a little bit more murky. And there's not going to be a perfect decimal place answer to all this, but if we can even add some sort of directional and tiering clarity, I think that will be really valuable for the broader cybersecurity and cyber risk management community. So that's another area, those metrics around cyber loss that within the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, that's going to continue to be a part of our cyber risk management portfolio going forward. And we look forward to continuing to lean into that and working with partners as is necessary. And then a third area we're going to continue leaning into is around better understanding in this interconnected systems of systems world, the criticality and the comparative criticality of the underpinning building blocks, the hardware, software, and services that make up the connected world. And, you know, it's kind of an overused phrase sometimes these days, but if everything is critical, nothing is critical. And when we look at across the ICT and ICS ecosystem and how those hardware, software, services, third parties, other components, how they all stitch together to collectively enable the functions that the American people need, whether it's our IT functions or it's electricity or it's the processing of financial transactions, some portions, some building blocks within those chains are more critical than others, or if degraded, the consequence will be higher. And we need to start to understand at a more detailed level with more fidelity the comparative criticality of these digital building blocks, if you will. And CISA has started doing that already with work we did in support of an executive order that came out last May. And this was the executive order on securing the information communications technologies and services supply chain. And it gives the Department of Commerce authorities there around certain transactions for the ICT ecosystem that may be of unacceptable risk to the nation. But DHS and CISA, we provided decision support, vulnerability and risk analysis of the ICT ecosystem. And what we did is we took the big world of information communications technologies and services, and we boiled it down to ultimately get to 61 underpinning elements. So we got down to the granularity of sort of your server, your router, your base station controller, your satellite uplink cable, things like that. So that was a level of granularity and was a really helpful taxonomy for us for the first time to sort of deconstruct the connected world into the underpinning building blocks. And then from there, we did criticality analysis in terms of understanding, if degraded, what would be the consequence on the overall system, recognizing that these systems have all sorts of functions that the American people depend upon. And so that was a really helpful exercise for us. We are continuing to doing work there because we think that is vitally important going forward, is to better understand criticality in this complicated, interconnected systems of world. And I think that is how we can sort of fully stitch together the threat, as I talked about China and obviously other cyber actors, the vulnerability, talked about how we live in this sea of vulnerabilities right now, some of higher severity than others, and how patching is important, but it doesn't necessarily translate directly to a risk management outcome. Better understanding some of the metrics around quantification of cyber loss and cyber incident, and then continuing to mature our understanding of criticality across the connected systems in America. When you stitch that all together, I think we're really going to together advance our understanding of cybersecurity risk management and how we can buy down risk for the nation, for the organizations that service the critical infrastructure community, and generally just have a positive outcome for the cyber resilience of the nation. So central to all of that is going to be partnership. None of that can be done alone. And I know you're going to hear from more speakers later today about some of the issues we're facing. And I think they'll say the same message, is everyone plays a role in this. And so when we talk about stitching together and maturing the understanding of threat, vulnerability, consequence to drive the risk management outcomes we all want, that's a good thing. We all know where we want to get to. It's going to continue to require partnership. And so I think events like this are a really helpful way of continuing the conversation, but have enjoyed kicking things off this morning with some thoughts. And I know we have a little time for some Q&A here, but again, really appreciate the opportunity to share CIS's perspective on this important issue. So Thelma, thank you.
No, thank you, Director Cruz. Wow, what a way to start the morning. There has been a tremendous outpouring of interest, and it is here in the list of questions that have come in through your talk this morning. And so I see we have quite a few. I know we won't be able to get to all of them, but we will do our best. So looking here, our first question coming in from one of our government partners. Could you discuss how federal agencies protect, defend, and secure supply chain against cyber threats? And then also discuss the challenges that arise as technology becomes more fundamental to supply chains?
Sure, absolutely. That's a great question. And as I mentioned earlier, I think sometimes we fall into this trap of trying to silo related disciplines. And in my day-to-day job, I have a really hard time disaggregating cybersecurity risk management, supply chain / third-party vendor risk management, and just broader critical infrastructure protection efforts. And I think that's not a bad thing. It highlights the way that these are all interwoven at the moment. In terms of what the government is doing right now around supply chain security, there have been a number of really significant developments over the last few years. I'll talk about two that we're quite involved in. One is, so I mentioned that Kaspersky Labs example. That was kind of a one-off lever that the Department of Homeland Security pulled. And, we have had other binding operational directives before, but there's recognition that we want really sort of harmonized activity across the U.S. government of when we think a manufacturer or an entity poses undue risk of being able to take action accordingly. And so in legislation enacted at the end of 2018, the Federal Acquisition Supply Chain Security Act, it created this Federal Acquisition Security Council that is being stood up as we speak. And the Federal Acquisition Security Council really has three main pillars of it. It's got civilian.gov through DHS and CISA. It's got the Department of Defense and the military world. And it's got the intelligence community represented by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And so it's got all three of those agency heads there sitting as principals, those three stools, if you will, who are able to go through and make together exclusion and removal orders across all three of the domains they have jurisdiction over, the .mil, the .gov, and the IC. And so that is getting operationalized as we speak. And it's led by Grant Schneider from the Office of Management and Budget, and he has said that he expects in the not too distant future the rulemaking that kind of provides the governance for that to be released. And so we are very close to having this operational body that can actually make in concert across those three domains exclusion and removal orders for untrusted vendors and equipment. And so I think that's a really welcome development and one that brings together all the right stakeholders. Second one on the partnership side is DHS CISA. We run and oversee the ICT Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force, which has really been a groundbreaking partnership effort where we bring together 20 of the key interagency players in supply chain risk management. We bring together 20 industry leaders from the communications sector, and then 20 industry leaders from the IT sector, and then hundreds of other SMEs to really tackle some of the longer term strategic supply chain challenges that we face. And right now there's a number of working groups and efforts that we're chewing on. One that I'll highlight for everyone here in terms of just where supply chain risk management kind of demands its dedicated study is we have a working group around info sharing concerns for supply chain threats right now. And many of you are probably aware in 2015, there was a huge legislative push around providing liability protection for the bidirectional sharing of cyber threat indicators between industry and government. And that was enacted. That was seen as a very positive move for this ecosystem. When we're talking about sharing cyber threat indicators, those are often technical ones and zeros. When we're talking about sharing supply chain threat information, what we're really talking about is companies sharing their judgment calls and their risk judgment on other entities. A company may have been deciding what vendor to use for some IT service, and they decided with a vendor and against other vendors, perhaps because they had some concerns about those vendors. So if they have concerns about those vendors, that is a potential supply chain risk for the nation. But how did they share that judgment, recognizing that it may be imperfect, it may be qualitative in nature to some degree? How did they share that for the benefit of the community without opening themselves up to enormous civil litigation risk and sort of anti-competitive behavior and things like that? And so that is one thing that this task force is looking at right now. We'll have some, I think, some pretty telling recommendations later on in the fall as it hits its 2-year mark, but around how do we think about the information sharing concerns around supply chain threat information, which are inherently about judgments of manufacturers, and how are those different from existing conversations we have had about information sharing for more technical and oftentimes anonymized cyber threat indicators. And so that's been an interesting conversation that has come out of this task force, which has been a great sort of center of gravity, if you will, for partnership and supply chain risk management. And I think that complements quite well on the federal side, that Federal Acquisition Security Council I mentioned, which is getting up and running as we speak. So plenty more to come on the supply chain front in the federal government.
Thank you. One of our media affiliates has asked if you would discuss the challenging and evolving cyber threat landscape associated with emerging technologies.
Sure, absolutely. And so emerging technology means a bunch of different things to a bunch of different people, but I have spent a good deal of my time over the last 2 years here focused on 5G networks and the risk around 5G networks. And this has been a really exciting time, but sort of with high stakes to work in the US government and to first of all, about understanding how 5G will fundamentally transform every aspect of our society. It's about more than just 100 times faster download speeds, and you can download a high-def video on your phone in 1.2 seconds or something like that. It's recognizing that this will be the new way of connectivity over the next few decades here. And we talk about autonomous vehicles and smart cities and telehealth and all these other industrial applications of 5G. The data integrity concerns there are greater than ever before. And one of the central to the 5G conversation has been around this concept of, do you trust the vendors who make this? And what makes 5G so much different, and you talked about, well, what is an emerging technology? One of the fundamental differences from 5G compared to previous 4G and 4G LTE buildouts is the role of software in 5G networks. And a lot is virtualized in 5G networks that previously were done by sort of physical switches in previous network versions. And so there's all sorts of ability to have software-defined networking where the software is offering the functionality where before it wasn't. And this presents a lot of opportunity for things like network slicing and enhanced functionality of these networks, but also poses an enormous risk where if you don't have trust and assurance in that software or the manufacturer of that software, then you potentially set yourself up for massive data integrity issues. And with 5G, the data integrity issues aren't just about privacy or intellectual property. When we're talking about the industrial use cases, the data that underpins and transits 5G networks, that'll power a whole host of use cases where if compromised, there are conceivable public health and safety issues from that as well. And so you really, with 5G, there's no other way to cut it. You have got to have trust and assurance in the vendors who make that, recognizing how hard it is to have post-deployment software assurance in 5G networks. And really interesting studies, what the UK study came out about from their Huawei Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, and then an independent researcher, Finite State, what they did, analyzing the firmware of a bunch of Huawei 5G routers. It becomes abundantly clear that the security culture at that company simply leaves too much room to be desired for. And then even on top of that, when you're talking about software-defined networking, you're going to have monthly firmware refreshes. And so that's standard cybersecurity practice. And so when you're having millions of lines of code, exponentially more code than 4G, it's really hard to have post-deployment software assurance because the code is just changing too fast. And so whether it's a bug door or a backdoor really becomes irrelevant because there is just too much of a chance of vulnerabilities across that software that could result in a lack of data integrity. And that's really where the US government, in our position on untrusted manufacturers such as Huawei, that's really where that has stemmed from. Is it you marry the strategic intent of China, I mentioned APT-10 Cloud Hopper, you marry that with their demonstrated activity, and I mentioned obviously APT-10 and the data exfiltration, the intelligence laws in that country, which compel private sector engagement in ways that the United States does not have. And then the realities of the architecture and componentry of 5G networks that are software heavy, or even with the best intentions and the best testing labs, is almost impossible to have post-deployment software assurance where you can fully understand that that code is vulnerability free at any given point. You bake all that up together, and the US government has reached what we believe is a very defensible risk judgment based on untrusted vendors, particularly those from China. And I think we are heartened to see this week the decisions that came out of the UK to actually start to tack towards our position and make their networks Huawei free from by 2027. It was a recognition of a lot of what I just laid out here, that in software heavy networks that will underpin the connected world for the coming decades, you need to have trust and assurance in the software in those networks, in the manufacturers of who makes those networks, and in the intent of the company where those manufacturers are domiciled in. And if you go for 0 for 3 on that equation, that probably tells you something in terms of the level of trust that you need with other alternatives for that emerging technology.
Thank you. We have another question from one of our industry partners that's extremely timely considering our current environment. What are the cyber lessons learned during the COVID-19 response? Can you discuss the security risk with remote working?
Absolutely, that's a great question. And at a high level, when you think back to early March and April, there was a mass shift to telework. And so we were just going to have more throughput and more taxing on our systems than we've ever had before with people working from home. The good news story here, and then I'll share a cautionary note at the end. The good news story is that in terms of the overall resilience of our communications and IT networks during COVID, when there's been mass shifts to telework, they have been remarkably resilient, right? You saw pockets of disruption or throughput issues, but by and large, America's ability to shift to telework heavy and virtual environments, I think has been something that has been a decent success story of all of this. That being said, there are a whole host of security concerns when you have people not working from their corporate networks, but working from their home networks all of a sudden. And a lot of the issues we saw early on where people were having a hard time transitioning, it wasn't necessarily that the capacity or the underpinning of the internet didn't have enough redundancy or resilience. It may have just been that their company, in terms of the number of concurrent user subscriptions for VPN networks, because they only had a small percentage of people working at home at any given point, they just didn't have an actually sort of at an enterprise level brought on that capacity to enable that. And so there was a little bit of kind of a last mile company problem we saw that admittedly was fixed rather quickly over sort of 10 days or 2 weeks, as companies realized where they had to sort of dial up the capacity they had and what they were paying for to enable safe work at home environments. But when people are connecting and doing their corporate work, which even if it's not classified, certainly may have intellectual property or trade secrets like that, when they're doing that from their home networks, again, it really broadens the attack surface. And so how safe are those home networks, right? You may have someone who, because they've got a Nest home camera or a baby camera or something like that, which is an IoT device where they never changed the default password away from what it was. If they're working at home now, that may be actually a way for an adversary to get into their corporate network inadvertently that didn't exist before. And so that's not necessarily anything against the overall resilience of our information communications networks. It's just a reality that when your home network now becomes your office network, you really have to think through, is my home network and the connected things on my home network and the security posture of that home network, is that fortified to the way that my enterprise would have done that on-prem? And CISA has put out a whole bunch of teleworking guidance around this. And so I encourage you to go to CISA's website, cisa.gov, and check out a lot of the telework guidance we put out, which is in that sphere that I just mentioned. What are the things people can do if they're now conducting their enterprise business at home to ensure that their home network has adequate security?
Director Cruz, how does an organization foster a culture of cyber readiness?
Yeah, that's a great question. Encourage you off the bat here to check out the CISA Cyber Essentials, where we lay out a bunch of things and we break it into different categories. The technical network operators, but then you as the user, that you can do to foster a culture of readiness. A lot of it starts with the person. You know, you can patch every vulnerability in the world and have the most robust network security apparatus, but you're still going to find people who sort of click the proverbial link, if you will. And so a culture of security is not just about your IT cycles and the layers of security you have and decisions you make about on-prem versus cloud and your subscription to threat feeds and how quickly you mitigate severe vulnerabilities. People are a huge portion of that. And I think if you look at the annual Verizon cyber breach report, I don't know the exact percentage, but it's something pretty high, like 30% of breaches, I believe, are actually the result of human behavior. And so that's, I think, a message I would leave for everyone here is don't underestimate the importance of investing in resilient behavior by your employees. Oftentimes, you have done everything else right, and that is the way that there's a cyber incident. It's just best practices by the employees themselves. So encourage you to check out the CISA Cyber Essentials on cisa.gov, and that can go over more of sort of how you can foster the culture of resilience. But a big takeaway, don't forget the importance of the people. That matters too.
One of your government counterparts is asking, how is your agency fostering diversity into information security? What does the cyber workforce of tomorrow look like?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's no secret that there are massive amounts, you know, something, a large percentage of cyber positions in this country remain unfilled. And I think the, you know, different estimates from different organizations, but it's a number of information security jobs is in the millions that are unfilled right now. And so that is an enormous opportunity for everyone to hire the future information security professionals of tomorrow that look like and represent America as a whole. That's a huge commitment of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and it's a commitment of Director Krebs, who is our leader. So diversity and inclusion is a huge part of our agency's mission. It's particularly relevant now when we're looking at how, when we, you know, like every other organization, we have vacancies in a lot of our cyber and information security jobs. And we want to have an agency that reflects America. So that's going to continue to be an important from the top down, something that we take very seriously, and continuing to work on ways to speed up the hiring process. I think a way of getting diverse and unique backgrounds and perspectives of candidates in is as we continue to find ways for that pipeline of people coming to work for the federal government and lending their talents. That's going to be part of it. I think, of course, there's a lot of conversations right now around how we can better have sort of the tour of duty concept where people from the private sector can come to government for a few years and then go back. The partnership for public service in conjunction with some private sector partners like MasterCard and Workday and Microsoft have a good effort right now around how that tour of duty can be facilitated. So I think that's a key part of it. You can bring some candidates into the federal government that maybe hadn't taken a traditional path like others had. So I think all of that is a part of it. And I think the overall takeaway for us right now is we very much want to have a cybersecurity infrastructure security agency that looks like America. And right now, across all agencies and all entities that are trying to hire in cybersecurity roles, the reality is that there are vacancies, and we're all working diligently to fill those. And we continue to work on initiatives that help at a young level, sort of the K through 12 level in high school and vocational and two-year college, making sure that people have that skill set early on so that the pipeline is strong. It's easier to hire a diverse cyber workforce that looks like America if we also have that pipeline as well. So we're engaged at all levels of this conversation. There's no silver bullet, but it is a vitally important issue. So I appreciate it being raised.
I think we have, if you can bear with us, just 2 to 3 more questions. What advice would you have for cyber rising stars?
For cyber rising stars, well, the federal government and, to get parochial here, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency would love you. So that's a good, to have you. So that's a good segue from the last conversation I had. And I would encourage them to reach out to CISA, and we have a hiring fair coming up at the end of the month, actually. It starts on July 27th, I believe, a virtual hiring fair. So I can tell them if that's helpful. I can send you information from that following up here. But we want to get young people in early on. And I think that's for all cyber agencies and all cyber organizations. It's not just about recruiting and hiring that really talented and experienced sort of 45-year-old mid-career executive. It's how can we hire that hard charging, hungry 22-year-old out of college as well and get them in the ranks early. So I'll send you some information afterwards on this hiring fair. And obviously I got the mic now, so I get to be a little parochial, but and obviously there are other hiring fairs for other agencies going on here, but it's an important time. And to the extent that people young want to find a foot into the U.S. government and be part of the Homeland Security, national security, and cybersecurity conversation early, we would certainly welcome that. So please come our way.
Thank you for that. I will look forward to that information, and we will share it with our affiliates as well. One last question, actually 2 questions. So this question is coming in from a media affiliate. It's often said that cyber is a team sport. How so?
I think to an earlier point I made, if you look at the role of government, the role of industry, the role of different parts of government, both the executive branch and the Hill, the role of people in academia and the think tank world, the independent security research world, all of those matter right now. The role of state and local governments, if you look at a lot of the work we're doing right now in election security, engaging over 2,500 counties directly right now as we ensure that we protect the integrity of the 2020 election, which is a top mission of our agency right now. We are dealing there with election vendors, with state officials, with county officials, with CISA, DHS, the intelligence community, briefing the Hill frequently. So I think that's a really good top of mind example for me right now when it comes to something vitally important for the nation, like securing the 2020 election. It is a whole of society, whole of government effort. So team sport is a nice way of sort of encapsulating that. It's a phrase I have used often as well, but I don't think it's a cliche in this sense. I think it's actually what we're seeing play out day to day.
Thank you. And finally, What key takeaways would you share with this government, industry, and media audience today?
I think the key takeaway here is that, again, I'll use the last question as a segue. Cyber is indeed a team sport. I think we have more awareness and more interest in being part of the cybersecurity conversation than ever before. The landscape is totally changing here. And as I said, the intersection of cyber vulnerability management, of third-party supply chain risk management, of infrastructure protection, these are all a part of the larger foundational conversation about, in a digitally connected world, how do we have integrity in the data and the systems that hold that data that underpin our way of life as Americans. And so it is all converging right now, but that is an exciting time to be part of these conversations and really why we need summits like this.
Well, thank you, Director Cruz, for your insightful comments on the challenging and evolving cyber threat landscape, the importance of partnerships, and CISA's critical role in cyberspace. I hope that you can hear and feel the virtual applause.
I'll take your word for it. Thank you, Thelma.
It's been my pleasure. And now, I'm pleased to introduce our next segment, our panel, Preparing for the Challenges of Tomorrow's Cyber Landscape, with our distinguished government and industry experts. It is my privilege to introduce our moderator, Nicole Johnson, Managing Editor, GovLoop. In her role, she writes and leads the development of in-depth reports and online news articles for the government community, with focus on the technology space. Prior to joining GovLoop, she covered government IT issues at FedTech and State Tech magazines, Federal Times, and C4 ISR networks. Please join me in a warm Electrosoft ITPA NCC welcome for our moderator extraordinaire, Nicole Johnson.
Thank you so much, Thelma. Hopefully my audio sounds okay to everyone. I'll trust that it is. Good. I'm getting the nod of approval, so this is good. I'm certainly pleased to be joining you all as a part of the Electrosoft ITPA Cybersecurity Summit. We just came off of a really insightful keynote that I think plays really well into the conversation we're having here today about preparing for the challenges of tomorrow's cybersecurity landscape. One of the things I was most impressed with was just, the conversation around there being so much interconnectedness. And we know it's not just one company or one agency, which is why we have this impressive mix and lineup of government and industry speakers for you today. So if I could have my panelists please turn on their cameras so we make sure we have everyone here. We have Kevin Cook Jr., he's Principal Deputy CIO for the Housing and Urban Development Department. Larry Hale, Director, IT Security Subcategory, Federal Acquisition Service at GSA. We have Nithya Rashamadugu. I was practicing, hopefully Nithya, I did you justice. Senior Director, Signacom Solutions. And we have Jesse Showers. He's President, Global Enterprise Services LLC. He's former Director of Infrastructure Directorate at DISA. And Dave Simpson, Rear Admiral DOD. He's retired, but he is Principal Deepwater Point LLC. So we have 5 amazing speakers. We're going to try to pack a lot into this hour. Similar to the previous panel, I encourage our attendees to submit questions. I will work those in throughout and make sure I save some time at the end. So I figured a good place for us to start, and I want to start, I'll go down the list and start with Jesse, but if we, can take a look at what's something we don't know? Tell us something we don't know about how either your agency or a company is proactively preparing for tomorrow's cyber threats. What does that landscape look like? So Jesse, if you could kick us off and we can start with you.
Jesse, you're on mute.
And if Jesse's having a little technical difficulties, I can go ahead and start with Kevin because I think I know he's on as well. So if Kevin, if you want to kick us off, we can kind of go down the list.
Sure, I'll get started here. Good morning, everyone.
Great remarks from the opening speaker there. And I think that you'll hear some of the themes that he discussed echoed in many of the conversations that we're having. So like Nicole said, I'm the Deputy CIO at HUD. And I would say something that we're really focused on that folks may not know, we're really looking at going from a compliance sort of based approach to security to looking at a risk approach. So really trying to be much more proactive and getting ahead and talking about security in every single thing that we do, baking that into everything we do instead of layering it on top of other things. And so this includes looking at the workforce, not just the traditional cybersecurity workforce, but those programmatic folks that handle a lot of sensitive data and making sure they know that they have, pretty serious responsibilities with approach to cyber as well. That protection of data, just like what was discussed before, is everybody's job, to look at the protection of that data. And those folks in the programs that are working with the data know more than any of us, how serious, the information they have is, what it contains. If you think about what HUD does, and so, we're controlling everyone's mortgages, through our FHA program. So that's all of our, information, very sensitive in terms of PI and those kinds of things. But there's other critical infrastructure data that we have because of the work that we do around disaster recovery with FEMA and other agencies. So it's just making sure everybody has a really good feel for the information that we have and why it should be protected, and making sure they know all the things that we're doing in order to assist them in that. So it's a lot of education, and we've created, role-based training for these folks who are not, our traditional workforce, in addition to the mandatory cybersecurity. So I'll end it there, but I think that's probably the biggest thing, is just making sure that we are looking at it from a risk perspective and educating everyone within the agency, not just the cybersecurity workforce.
That is so critical and so timely, right? Especially as we're all working from different places. So we all need to be responsible for how we work. We all have some cyber responsibility, even if it's not in our title. So that was good. So many nuggets to come back to on that. But Larry, tell us about something we don't know about how you all are approaching the cyber threat landscape of tomorrow.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Nicole. So my role is slightly different in that I'm in the exciting position. I don't do cybersecurity for GSA, but I have the wonderful opportunity to help every other federal agency improve their cybersecurity. So as the director of the IT security subcategory in the Office of IT category in the Federal Acquisition Service, I manage our cybersecurity portfolio. So what I want to talk about here in the context of this discussion is the Highly Adaptive Cybersecurity Services Special Item Number, or HACS-SIN, which is in place to provide the services that agencies need to improve their cybersecurity, to add those services that they struggle to do internally, and especially to focus on their high value assets. So HACS was created in partnership with OMB and with CISA at DHS to augment. So DHS goes out and does high value asset assessments. They did 72 last year. Well, there's 23 capital level agencies. There's another 100 smaller agencies across the government. And each agency has a number of high value assets. So instead of waiting for DHS to come and do a high value asset assessment, we need to secure our systems now. We need to secure our high value assets now. And HACS allows you to tap into that industry base of talent and expertise and do it now. In addition to that, on the HACS-SIN, most of the vendors who've passed the oral technical evaluation to get on the HACS-SIN are small businesses. So you can get your veteran-owned small business, women-owned small business. You can take advantage and help the economy with small business and socioeconomics. by utilizing this also category management, tier 2 spend under management, well-managed contract. So that's my public service announcement about hacks. Happy to engage in the discussion going forward. Thanks.
I love that. You have to put a plug in for what you're doing. You have to. And speaking of our talent and expertise in industry, Nithya, tell us something we don't know about what you're doing, what your team is doing.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you to Electrosoft and ITPA for having me. I had a lot of nods when the opening statement and the keynote speaker was speaking in this morning, because we do a lot of those things to help the industry be secure. So one of the things that he did mention was the test and assurance, and that's where I come in. Right, I'm the director of 2 labs, the Common Criteria and the FIPS lab. These are government assurance programs. Basically, you can say we are like insurers. We ensure that to some extent that the product that the government uses are tested correctly and tested, they are produced, designed, built, and delivered securely. They follow standard cryptography, and they can perform consistently with repeatable results and address the ladest known vulnerabilities. So that's where I come in. And we are third-party testers of products.
Perfect. Well, thank you for that, Nithya. We definitely, that's definitely needed, as we heard earlier this morning. Dave, I'd love to hear something we might not know about how your team is addressing the cyber threat landscape.
Great. Well, I am in a consultant role now. So what we do is help companies think about their challenges and responsibilities in this space. I spent 3 years as the vice director of DISA, and then 3 years as the bureau chief of the Public Safety Homeland Security Bureau at the Federal Communications Commission, where I had the great honor of working with many of your member companies, ITPA, and really grew to love and appreciate the role that small and medium telecommunications service providers have for our nation. It's critical that now, I believe, that challenge of interconnectedness be associated for you as interdependencies that are now core to your business functions. 5G, while it will be brought about by the wireless service providers, will also impact wireline providers in a big way. The 5G protocols will extend beyond just the wireless side. Those slices will go into terrestrial wireline communications, into the core. They'll also be utilized by your consumers in Wi-Fi 6, and this concept of your threats no longer being contained just within the part of the service you're providing generates a shared risk that it's really important for you to sort through. Just think of smart TVs as they begin to take an IP packet-based input from the changes that are going on with broadcast TV in the new ATSC protocols. So very significant new threat vectors that are going to then be multiplied by the Internet of Things that are made possible through Wi-Fi. What does that mean for small telecommunications service providers? You guys know better than we do how much of an economy of force approach you have to have towards cybersecurity. You're not able to bring the resources that large companies can have here. And that just means that you have the opportunity to be smarter in this than they are. But taking a step back and planning, and not just perceiving that you can do this with a single contract or single product that you're going to bring into your space is key. And so I advocate the 3 A's, right? Assess, appreciate that assessment in the context of your business goals, and then address. And the NIST framework that the FCC worked with you all on is a great place to start. Be ready to identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And CISA is a great teammate for that. And I'll also give a shout out to GSA, because those contracts that Larry described can also be consumed at the state and local level as well. Larry is working now to include something called the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification beyond just the Department of Defense and the Defense Industrial Base, but now to be available to all the civilian agencies as well, and an item that will be required by contract for service going forward. So it's really not an if you get organized for cyber. It's a if you value federal contracts, then or your consumers do, then you're going to be part of their supply chain that will be implicated by the cybersecurity maturity model certification. So there are many of us that can help you deconstruct that problem set and put together an incremental, getting better every year program. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Dave. GSA getting all the plugs here. I think Larry and Dave were working together on their intros. Jesse, hopefully your audio, I think you're with us. So tell us something we don't know about what you and your team are doing to address the cyber threat landscape.
Absolutely. Hopefully you can hear me this time. Can you hear me now?
Sound good.
Okay. My team and I, we're really focused on working with small businesses, the folks in the educational community, as well as some small government entities, on how they can better prepare for not only today's threats, but what the threats will be tomorrow. For example, how do they prepare for the next generation of cybersecurity, which will include, 5G, artificial intelligence, machine learning, software-defined networking, and Internet of Things, and all of those variety of different ways of dealing with what's next in the cyber world, and not only how do you assess, which we always talk about, but not just how you assess and defend it, but also how do you be more responsive to it before things happen to your networks. And the other big piece that we are kind of focused on is how you deal with the legacy networks and the difficulty of integrating those legacy networks or legacy devices into an environment today where everything is interconnected. And there's old vulnerabilities associated with those old systems that don't get a lot of attention. And we are trying to help folks focus on not just moving away from those technologies where possible, but also how they integrate those into their new cyber environment. I look forward to being on this panel and having this discussion.
Awesome. Well, now that we have introductions, we're all old friends, we all know each other. I want to, dive in and unpeel some layers of what you were talking about earlier. I was really, the role-based training really stuck out to me, especially, I mentioned as we're all working from different places, doing different things. I'd love to hear perhaps maybe how that factors into just your, your COVID-19 response and impact, like how that maybe impacted the way that you all approach cyber. If there's any examples or lessons learned that you can share there. It sounds like maybe the role-based training came in before COVID-19, but just trying to get a understanding of what that looks like. You can share
So
that.
I'll talk a little bit about role-based training, which probably nothing that we're doing unique. It's probably something others are doing. So traditionally, some of the roles, like the ISSOs and those kinds of things, of course, exist within the program and mission areas, along with some of the system ownership. And so what you have is a mixed bag of sort of experience and proficiency there. You may have folks who are doing this as a part-time responsibility. They drew the short straw, or they're the most tech savvy of a group of people that are really mission focused. And so one of the things that we needed to do there, specific to those roles and others, we created about 7 or 8 different training modules based on those sort of more non-traditional roles. And so that is something excuse me, that was done pre-COVID. The other thing that we've done is being very, very close to our Chief Privacy Officer and his staff and looking at those things. Again, I talked about before how we talk with the mission and program folks. So now I'll relate that to some of the things we've done around COVID. So the first thing, again, there are things that people, believe it or not, still using paper, those kinds of things, and have traditionally passed some of that information, documents, those kinds of things. And so because it was sort of this paper passing, even mailing things among our 80 offices, throughout the US, and now having to do everything sort of digitally and making sure everyone really understood their responsibilities around encryption, when it's sensitive information, even if it's not rising to the level of PI, but just sensitive in nature, and all of the things that are available to us through those features, looking at digital signatures on everything so we could become, pretty much paperless. This is something we've been working toward, but this issue with COVID, I'm sure, forced all of us to accelerate, all of the activities there. Being prepared to work 100% of your workforce remotely is also something that we looked at. You mentioned before that, working from home. Now we're dealing with all of the different ways that people are coming in from being at home to being in coffee shops or, wherever they may be, and not always having a secure environment. So we put a lot of instructions out about when you had to use the VPN, when it was okay just to, deal with a regular Wi-Fi connection, no matter where you are. So that's something that was very specific to COVID, and just thinking about security all the time, which is something that, when we're in the comfort of our offices, excuse me, it feels like we've done most of that work for our employees. So now this was a little different in terms of, again, them having to be much more of a participant in securing our information and connections and those kinds of things, and just giving them as much information as we could in order for them to feel comfortable in doing that. So those are some of the things we've done as a result of COVID.
Yeah, that was super helpful. And I keep starting with my government folks first to hear, Larry, Kevin mentioned, COVID forced them to accelerate some things that maybe they'd already been working on and being prepared to work remotely. I know there's some creative things GSA was doing, even how they interacted with industry, or any examples you can share maybe about how, COVID really, impacted the way you all look at the work that you're doing, maybe if, from a security angle or just in general that you can share with attendees.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. So GSA, really, we were very, very prepared to switch to 100% telework. The people in the agency got tired of saying we didn't miss a beat, but it really was seamless because we were well equipped. Our CIO, Dave Shive, and our CISO, Bo Burles, had the tools in place. And at GSA, we'd already been, because we consolidated down from multiple locations down to one, and we're in a telework environment, it was easy for most of us to quickly transition to doing our work from home. And we've always had a philosophy that work is what you do, not where you go. Work is not a place, work is your job. And so we do that from home. We continue to do it from home. It has been a challenge for all agencies in terms of, as has been mentioned, you're on your home network, you're on your neighborhood's cable internet service provider. So you're sharing the limited bandwidth with in your home. You're sharing it with other people who live in your home who are doing distance learning because they've been forced home from school. Other adults in your home are also trying to work from home, competing for the same bandwidth. They may be using apps that your agency doesn't authorize on your system. So, whether you're using your government furnished laptop or you're using a virtual machine on your personal laptop, all of those considerations have to be taken into account. We have seen an uptick in the purchasing or the utilization of our continuous diagnostics and mitigations tools. So we've seen agencies quickly respond and deploy new tools and augment their current suite of tools in order to handle the shift from depending on the agency's internal infrastructure to depending on work in the cloud and managing that access anywhere, do your work anywhere kind of environment, and the challenges that come with that. It's really, I'm happy and proud of GSA, glad to be a part of GSA, because we're ready to work anywhere, anytime, and we continued. And honestly, without the commute, we're all working longer hours and longer days. It's crazy. I do not miss the commute though. The downside of being telework ready is there's no such thing as a snow day. And I understand it's the middle of July, but when we became telework equipped and telework ready, we stopped having snow days. We work, we just log on and work no matter what's going on outside. And that's a great thing. It's a great thing for the taxpayers. It's a great thing for the American people. And we're happy to do it.
Oh, I know. Telework ready is always ready. I thought I heard someone take a deep breath. Was someone going to comment on or piggyback?
Yeah, Nicole, I'd like to piggyback on that.
Sure.
The Department of Commerce has identified 52 discrete work roles for cybersecurity. There's no way a small company is going to be able to have 52 employees, each an expert in that work role, contribute to their overall cybersecurity. So small companies, medium companies have to be smart about this and have to look at the work roles that NIST and the Department of Commerce has identified and determine where they can aggregate work roles into a single employee's set of responsibilities. But there literally are some work roles that just won't be cost effective for you to account for, that you should consider services for, either services from other vendors or services from the government, like the assessment service that our previous speaker described at CISA. Those are excellent resources to make sure that you've got a holistic approach. The final point here, in tying work roles to COVID, essentially by taking employees that used to be in the office on endpoints that you controlled to now out of the office on endpoints that were, even if it's your endpoint, even if it's your endpoint that they've taken home that's connected via VPN, now is commingled with endpoints that you don't control, is using the same Wi-Fi, is exposed to those applications and malware that you otherwise would have accounted for with your enterprise IT staff. So you have to think about shifting some of these work roles to your employees working from home and make sure that they're smarter about hygiene, about the internal controls that need to make sure that networks are safe, that are interconnected to your network. A VPN just means that a malware that's on a home endpoint is, that malware is protected all the way back into your system. The VPN isn't the cyber protection. Thanks.
No, that was great. I want this to be conversational, and I see we've, had some questions come in. I think it was really interesting too, to Larry's point about what he's seeing in terms of what agency customers are wanting from GSA to make sure that they're well positioned for what's here and what's coming. One of the questions we had come in was, has there been an overall assessment of the impact of legacy systems in the cybersecurity landscape? And I know, Jesse, you talked some about, assessments in general. If you can kind of share what you're seeing or experiencing with the customers you're working with in government in terms of that impact on legacy as people are trying to prepare for a cyber landscape of the future.
Yeah, in general, in legacy systems, the legacy vulnerabilities that are identified, folks identify them, they take care of those vulnerabilities, and then they kind of forget about them. In the current generation of cybersecurity, you're constantly patching systems, you're constantly updating systems. That doesn't happen in legacy systems. You tend to have them connected to, and believe it or not, there's still modems that actually exist in the Department of Defense where folks can dial in to folks. So you can hack through a system through a telephone line, get access to a legacy system, which is then connected to an IP system, which gives you access to the network, right? So you have to pull that thread all the way through, and you have to continually protect or eliminate that legacy system. Otherwise, you have what I call backdoor vulnerabilities that you have not accounted for, that are constantly sitting there with adversaries on those systems, just waiting for an opportunity to do something to your networks. So,
I think I got stuck at modem. I was listening and I was like, what?
There are actually still modems in the government on legacy systems. And then you have your ship-based systems that also have legacy systems that have low bandwidth systems that are also vulnerable. And you have satellite systems that have vulnerabilities associated with them as well. So you have to look at the whole ecosystem of telecommunications, which include IP, and not just the new latest IP-based technologies. It's all of the ecosystem that you have to protect from in cyberspace. And I don't think we do a good job of that, both in the local, state education and universities, as well as in the government.
Right.
Hey, Nicole, Jesse's absolutely right on this. And the questioner originally linked this to the Y2K challenge.
Mm-hmm.
This has a lot of similarities to Y2K. And for those that are around back then, Y2K implicated a whole ecosystem of controllers and circuit boards that you never would have thought could have provided a threat to your organization during the rollover. So it forced us to look at that system of systems nature of your information environment. Fast forward to today, though, Y2K was nicely cabined around some specific calendar events. And so the remediation that took place was one and done. What we have here with legacy system, it is ongoing, sustained, a thinking adversary that is continually looking for ways to exploit legacy systems. And the longer you have legacy systems in your environment, the greater the risk becomes. The greater the risk because the adversary has figured out a way to compromise those, but also the vendors that provide those systems put less and less and less into security sustainment for those legacy products. So where in the past it used to be buy, keep it for 20 years if it's doing its job, or 30 years, and just sit on it, you increasingly should think about having a bias towards new, because the cost of sustaining cyber readiness for legacy equipment that creates threats in your environment will go up and may exceed the cost of being on a regular upgrade cycle for products and services that are regularly patched as sustainment from the vendor.
Right. Unless you're me and hold on to your iPhone 6S for years until you can't anymore. But here I am, I've upgraded, so I'm proud of myself. But, you know, as I was asking the question about a legacy and, you know, thinking about how that fits into looking at the cyber threat landscape of the future, Nithya, I feel like I saw you shaking your head in agreement. Perhaps there's something you were seeing or hearing from the customers you're working with, things you want our attendees to know about that, what they should be considering.
Sure, definitely. I do have a couple of points that I want to make from the previous conversations. I also feel that in the legacy systems, although it is old, it's not maintained, the attack surface is a little less as compared to the innovative new products. You open up more doors when you do provide more features. And if you have legacy system, it's easier, a little bit easier to control the environment that it runs in. So there are some, you know, although it is legacy, there are some advantages to still having some legacy system in that sense. Then I also wanted to add a little bit to the COVID questions that were going on. There was a time in our lives when people would come, when some team member would come and say, I want to work from home. a couple of days and we would say, why? And now tables have turned and the organizations are asking, why do you need to come into the office? Tell me why. Do you really need to come in? Can you not work from home? Things like that, right? So our security parameters and the perimeters of that have changed and kind of become bigger and larger. So we not only are working in a closed environment where security can be enforced, and now it becomes difficult because we are not only just working from home, we are also working sometimes on the road, sometimes from a grocery line, right? So there are more ears and eyes listening than before. We, even at home, even if you keep it secure, what guarantee is it that your VPN is not hacked into? Not there is no car parked outside which is listening in, or your next door neighbor is not listening in, or one of your IoT devices at home is not listening in, right? So there are conversations, there are cameras all over, which could pose a big threat. And if you go into even lower levels in terms of paperwork, right? So there are not many people feel comfortable working 8 hours or more looking at your screen. So when you have a big document, you tend to print it. How do you dispose of it? When you're in the office, in the control environment, you have a trash can where it gets shredded. But that is not the case always in the at-home environment. So there are many other threats to it, which may seem very elementary, but still, because the workforce is so large and working so much, it becomes such a habit to work from home that you forget that these little things can cause a big, big disastrous situation to your company. Absolutely. So definitely hygiene is part of the hygiene, good hygiene, teach and tell them and tell them again is what seems to be working, right? You have to, there is no way to enforce this unless people understand the risks behind these.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let me take a pause there. This is good. The conversation is good. And I want to encourage our attendees to continue submitting questions as well. I wanted to go to Larry for a minute to, peel back some threads. Larry, you started talking about, what your government customers are coming to you for at this time, especially during COVID. I think it'd be interesting both for our government and industry attendees to hear more about, when your customers are thinking about cyber threat landscape of the future, what they're looking at, what their needs are. Maybe others in government want to know, what are my government counterparts doing? And then those in industry want to know, well, what does government need? So if you can kind of shed more light on that, looking at now and forward, what people are wanting.
Well, thank you, Nicole. So a lot of what we've been describing, especially with the expansion of the work environment, therefore the expansion of the agency environment, beyond the old traditional perimeter, cries out for the concepts, and I'm not endorsing any single company or any single brand, but the concepts of zero trust, meaning what we've heard the other speakers describing, where you don't know who's listening, you aren't in control of the endpoints, you're not necessarily in control of the pipes that are being used. So that requires much more attention to the fundamentals of zero trust, meaning strong identity management, strong privilege management, and continuous monitoring of those capabilities, of those functions. And and that's where we've seen this, as I described, this uptick in utilization of the continuous diagnostics and mitigation tools to enforce those policies, to allow agencies to promote working from home while at the same time protecting the data, recognizing that the attack surface has changed, but that the tools are there and available to be properly implemented. It's a huge challenge because, of course, you have legacy tools, you have a legacy environment, and you know, it's not necessarily a rip and replace scenario where you know, okay, tomorrow we you know, or next weekend we shut down for 48 hours, and on Monday we're going to be a zero trust shop. You know, you just don't do that. It's not that way. You have to implement, or you have to integrate your existing environment, recognize where the gaps are in your existing environment, assess that, and assess the appropriateness of the tools you have, your current base, with the new work environment, and what new vulnerabilities are you exposed to, what new tools, what new capabilities, what changes do you need to make to your current identity policies and privileges in order to adapt to this new environment. So yes, with the CDM tools special item number that we created to support and augment the DHS CDM program, Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program. I thank Dave for the plug, because one of the things I'm really proud of about the CDM tools SIN is, you know, the CDM program was designed for civilian executive branch agencies, and it focuses on civilian executive branch agencies. But the CDM tools SIN, DHS made a conscious choice when they partnered with GSA. They wanted the CDM tools SIN on the GSA schedule so that state, local, tribal governments, and also DOD, National Guard, et cetera, could get access to those same tools, even though they're not part of the official CDM program. There's no reason they can't avail themselves of the same tools, and through marketing those capabilities on the GSA schedule, that's open and available. And we are absolutely here to help state, local governments get access to the tools, and also to the services to implement, install, configure, and manage those tools.
Right. No, that's awesome. And I see Kevin in deep thought. I feel like he has words of wisdom to share about, you know, what HUD is looking for, what they need, kind of what your either pain points, or kind of, you know, from a cyber and tech perspective. I can sense the synergy. I know you have something to say here, so this is good.
That was me beaming over to you. Just as he was talking about the CDM program, and those are things that just resonate. I mean, it's something that is a welcome tool for agencies to get that kind of help through CISA and other programs, you know, that we have, because there are things that we're able to do that we couldn't do on our own, and sort of this group of all these, you know, smart people throughout the agencies kind of coming together to think about those. So it's something we're certainly taking advantage of. I think the other thing is, as we mature, you know, our SOCs and NOCs and those kinds of things, and continue just to look at tools, and we're able to share ideas across on, you know, what's working well at other places, what's not, and just sort of saving us time. And so I was literally sort of taking a couple of notes here on things that I wanted to have my folks follow up on other things, you know, that may even be available to us. And one other note was on the legacy systems and having to deal with those. We still have a lot of COBOL systems, 2 different mainframes. And so those things certainly require sort of a different look. And so this assessment of all of our systems is something that everybody, I think, is doing. And the last note I had here is, at least we don't have modems. That was like...
The shade is real.
Yeah.
No, but that's real. I you know, because we hosted an event the other day about mainframes, and I had never been in such an engaging conversation about mainframes. And I think the reason being is it was about people. It was about the people who've committed their careers to like writing code, understanding systems, and how do you get people on board with moving away from the old, it's never going to go away, but to also looking at the new, whether it's training or helping them see the bigger picture. So that people part that you were talking about earlier too, Kevin, like it's so intertwined, like you can't get away from that.
Let me jump in there. So we have, through the TMF program, being sponsored by GSA and the federal CIO, one of the modernization projects we're undertaking is to get all the applications that are on our Unisys mainframe migrated, to more modern technology. They're written in COBOL. Believe it or not, we have people that have been working on those same systems like 38, 39 years. So when you start thinking about the workforce, the original, COBOL folks are rare and hard to find, if they're still working. I think at my college, I was probably one of the last classes that had to take COBOL. So they're not even, sort of teaching that anymore. But I think to get to your point about getting folks interested in sort of these new things is the exciting part about what those systems do and the data that they're used, the analytics, all these things that can be better accomplished when you move, to more, more modern platforms and looking more extensively at the cloud versus, these huge mainframes that are on-prem. I think is something that you can, get folks excited about and being part of this migration. The hard part is that you have to get these folks who are some of the original programmers, not a lot of documentation, sometimes working with our folks who are more accustomed to the newer technology and finding a synergy there. And so anyway, that's something that, again, it's a big people thing and sort of getting these folks from different styles and sort of different perspectives to work together.
Yeah, no, that's huge, huge. Such great dialogue, you guys. I appreciate it. With 5 people, we are making it work here, and our audience is sending in good questions. I want to ask about, policy. I think we had a question come in, but for some reason I can't see it now. And I know, Dave, our policy guy, I think I'll start with you on this one too and kind of go around the team. So we heard, from CISA earlier this morning, I know a lot with, TIC 3.0 and trusted internet connections and how that ties into telework and other things. And we've, there's been some mention of the cybersecurity maturity model certification. So, I guess my question would be, as, for this panel, as we consider the cyber landscape of tomorrow, where do we see cyber policies playing a major role and where might they be falling short? So Dave, kind of your thoughts in general on like the role policies playing, yes, I see this making an impact and where might we need to do some work still?
Yeah, so at the federal level, most of ITPA's members are governed by the Federal Communications Commission, and the FCC has adopted very much a voluntary approach that allows telecommunications service providers to right size their cyber programs given their own operations. At the same time, however, we see the federal government getting more and more concerned about critical infrastructure. And so the DoD's effort around the cybersecurity maturity model certification will apply to over 300,000 companies in the United States that need to now certify to the NIST standard, one of 5 levels, the maturity of their cyber program. What we're seeing now is that what started as a defense industrial base for those 300,000 companies is including its supply chain and broadening their shoulders. So we expect that CMMC policy in some form to extend across all of the federal agencies. And the point for ITPA's membership is that the voluntary approach that the FCC has adopted in the last couple of years very well could be subsumed into that, because you guys are key critical infrastructure. And the Cyber Solarium report that just came out, bipartisan effort in Congress, has support from both parties to greatly improve the cybersecurity of critical infrastructure. So I believe for ITPA's membership, you really need to be thinking about the expanding universe of compliance that will come from the federal government in this space, and begin to get ahead of it, not just because you want to remain compliant, but because there's a strong business case for being good at cyber.
Right. The right thing to do, not just because you have to do it. You know, I think we're coming up with, we have about maybe 5-ish minutes or so, but Jesse, would love to hear from you, if either commenting on, you know, the policy side, or so much has been said up to this point. If there are any follow-ups you wanted to do on some of the points that came up early, would love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, a couple general thoughts. Both from my experience when I was in the government as well as my commercial experience, is the adversaries don't read policy. So, and the hackers don't read policy. So we write documents that make us feel better, but I'm not sure it accomplishes a lot from protecting our network. It creates a great framework, and it creates a way of doing business and building a business operation around cyber. But we have to understand that our adversaries they don't read documents and they don't respond to those documents. So how do we write policies that will be agile enough to deal with today's environments and the way people do business today? Also, when I think about when we're doing the monitoring, same experience is we monitor what we know, and we monitor the networks. We buy tools to fix today's problems. Well, our adversaries and the hackers are already working on tomorrow's problems. So how do we become more responsive to things that are happening to our network? And that has to be built into the technologies, that have to be built into the software, and it has to be built into our daily business operations of just how we do business. And we have to see that as beneficial to how we do our business. Otherwise, we will never be able to keep up, because the adversaries are always looking for new ways to get into our networks and to do bad things or to take data. So I would ask that we think about not just monitoring, but how do we respond when things happen to us that are unknown.
That was good. That was a whole word right there, Jesse. That's real. Nithya, I'd love to, I know you're a big proponent of, you know, being agile and actually putting things into use, right? We're not just writing things on paper, but actually doing something about it. Any comments from you on the policy side, or kind of follow-ups on some of the points mentioned?
Definitely, and I appreciate the last statement in there, that from my fellow panelists, that it should be built. So security cannot be bolted on. It has to be built. So when you develop the system, when you develop the environment, you have to build that security into it. It has to be part of your everyday DNA, so to speak. And I see that, you know, the government is doing something about it. There are assurances, like we do testing. It started with the crypto assurance and FEDS, and then the end-to-end cradle-to-grave assurance and common criteria, and then it went on to the FedRAMP, and then you know, there are several programs. Now there is CMMC, which is doing, again, a supply chain, which is extending the security beyond what you just developed, right? It's the pieces and the parts that go into the entire connected world as it is. We are realizing that the world is connected. We didn't think 25 years back that something that started somewhere in Asia would bring the entire world to a standstill and rethink how we work, right? So that is a good thing. So, and even the government, as I said, has done some things about it. So the policies are there for the government. Where I feel that it is not lacking is the industry adopting that. I see that the industry outside of the government is still not convinced that they should build assurance into that. They build security into it, but not assurance into that. So that's where I feel it's lacking.
That was so good. And I think I may have 1 minute, if we can all promise to do like a 10-second takeaway. I think I can fit that in before I get yanked off the virtual stage, but we will do rapid fire, quick takeaway for our audience members. So Kevin, I will start with you.
The only thing I would say quickly is just for those folks who are looking to help government in this space, just use your imaginations, be inventive, and bring these new solutions to us.
Perfect. Larry?
So CMMC is a great example of government leading the way again. And it's, don't expect it to sit still. Hats off to Katie Arrington and DoD for introducing it. GSA has added it to our evaluation criteria for the new 8A Stars 3 Small Business UAC. And that now sets a baseline standard for doing business with the government. It's definitely going to improve cybersecurity across the landscape.
Perfect. Jesse, our quick takeaway?
Think about the interconnection of your entire ecosystem, not just the latest technologies, but all the things that you are connected to and how you utilize all of those particular components in your daily environment, in your businesses as well. Okay.
Perfect. You guys are good. I love these snappy things. Dave, what's your quick takeaway?
ITPA members are in a regulated industry. They have an obligation to address cybersecurity proactively. If you're implementing the government policies in a way that isn't agile, you're doing it wrong. They're risk-based frameworks, not prescriptive checklists. They are designed to be agile. They're good policy, and you're beholden to it. So you saw it in the last CISA event or an hour ago. CISA understands how to go to court to hold somebody accountable for not meeting their minimum obligations.
All right, and Nithya, you get the last word of the day. What's your quick takeaway?
All right. So my takeaway is from this would be security is costly, expensive, time consuming, but it is not something that you can not do. Not doing it is more expensive. And I feel that the large companies generally know this and understand this, but it is the small businesses that take the risk, which may be too big a risk for the company, for the country, and for the world in general. So keep that in mind. A second takeaway I would also say is there's lots of assurances and available tools. Use them.
Perfect. Well, I want to give a virtual round of applause to our panelists. Thank you so much. And I'm sure everyone's clapping along with me. And with that, I will turn things back over to Thelma.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask the audience to join me in a spirited round of applause. And a thank you to our fabulous panelists. What a high energy panel session. Thank you so much to Kevin Cook Jr., to Larry Hale, to Nithya Rajamadugu, to Jesse Showers, and Rear Admiral David Simpson, and to our distinguished moderator, Nicole Johnson. Thank you all. Now, as we move into the third and final segment of our session today, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our closing keynote speaker, Bradford J. Wilkie, Assistant Director for Stakeholder Engagement, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Mr. Wilkie's team provides the front door to customers looking for CISA's capacity building and risk reducing products and services. His programs convene industry, state, and local governments, academic and nonprofit partners for the common goal of managing national risk. Mr. Wilkie has held key leadership roles in stakeholder engagement during his 10 years at DHS. He has served as a law enforcement officer in the United States Air Force with his recognized skills with IT networks, database design and programming, and security management. A warm Electrosoft and ITPA welcome to CISA's Bradford Wilkie.
Hey, thanks. Thanks, Thelma, and thanks for such a warm introduction. Glad we did not have to stand on too much ceremony with biographies and things like that. I'm always kind of cutting to the chase. It's more about the message, less about the person, I think, sometimes. So very happy to be here. Thank you, partners, ITPA and Electrosoft. And I truly mean that. My job as the Assistant Director for Stakeholder Engagement at CISA is a little bit different than you've heard from Rick Driggers in a past summit series that you had, as well as Daniel Cruz earlier this morning. My job is to make sure that we are very welcoming and that the chair that CISA offers can be pushed out as far as you need it to be so that you feel like you are stitched in at the hip with us as a partner who often knows more than we do. And I think just listening to Nithya and David, Larry, and Jesse and others from the last panel, I think, you know, they hit right down the middle of the partnership that we've tried to affect at CISA. And I think as a front door to the federal interagency on a number of critical infrastructure and cybersecurity matters. So I think I would just say ditto to what they said. You know, we are definitely trying to move the environment more towards a risk-based consideration. I think you heard Daniel Cruz talk about national critical function and the context setting that provides us all to kind of elevate the discussion above threat actors and behaviors and what they're doing, and then just the perennial litany of best practices or even compliance requirements that many organizations have. So somewhere above that technologist sort of view of cybersecurity is an infrastructure view, a view of resilience, a view of the national economy, a view of things that go right to our democratic principles as a nation, like elections. And so I really applaud them for helping to, again, extend the conversation, elevate it up to the things that we need to see there. Risk assurance, assurance cases that Nithya talked about, making sure we take an enterprise focus, making sure we focus on critical components in an inventive sort of spirit. So my job, I think, in the closing keynote is not to readjust your expectations of CISA, but really to explain how we work in our partnership model, and then certainly want to talk and hear some questions from our moderator, and then certainly pivot to the questions as you have them as attendees. I think I would back out and give you a slight reprisal, just 30 seconds here on what CISA is up to on the partnership side. You know, crowdsourcing was the kind of term of phrase that we used 5-6 years ago about, you know, why should we all approach reinventing the wheel, you know, in silos of excellence? Why can't we just appraise the situation, look at the key changes in a threat environment or in a partnership kind of environment, look at how we work and how we can work together and focus on those things. And then, you know, what are some of the key kind of observable behaviors we can see within a stakeholder ecosystem that tell us that things are getting better. And so my job at CISA is to make sure that as the nation's risk advisor that you heard Daniel talk about, you know, the risk is absolutely appraised through things like we're doing in our National Risk Management Center. But if you're not read in on how we're looking at it, if we're not appraising that risk space right with your consideration and input, if we don't have the pain points that you're feeling and the stressors that adversaries place upon you well known, then we've done a really great job of whiteboarding as a federal government and sort of looking at our own sort of risk environment and risk attack surface and our own tolerances and sensitivities to risk, but we really haven't given you a seat at the table to do that. So again, as Daniel and Rick probably mentioned, we're here to defend today and secure tomorrow. Our director, Chris Krebs, has 5 operational priorities, but instead of running you through those one for one and kind of unpacking them, what I would say is that that strategic intent that he rolled out in August ago, which seems like a year, a dog year, if you will, is really more about the way in which we want to work with you and the means in which we're going to provide that collaboration. And I would say I could sum up this entire discussion here with saying that we have provided great lip service to cybersecurity, right? It's a shared responsibility. We've said that if you have something to share, it's a see something, say something moment. We've said that it's all about public-private partnership. I want to move that and sort of show you the demonstrations that we've had with all of your assistance and help as the community of defenders, what we've been able to do over a very short period of time. So I'm going to navigate this next 15 minutes around some vignettes, and I got some key takeaways for you as well. The first kind of episode I want to draw your attention to is back in December of 2018, and it really was actually the culmination of 4 or 5 years worth of just being beat up in a cloud environment kind of manner. So the first sort of threat scenario or the threat expose I would give you, the vignette, is this whole idea that we arrived at in December 2018, where we saw and could finally speak about China's encroachment and malicious activity when it came to cloud service providers and cloud service environments. And so, that was really the end of a 4-year, 5-year discussion with industry, where if you looked at what we were really trying to say is that sometimes the actor is not self-evident when it comes to these longitudinal persistent attacks. It's great to say APT and sort of label the usual 4 bad nation states associated with persistent threats, but sometimes it's really not self-evident who is trying to crawl around a technology environment, for what purpose, with what long game, and so we decided around 2014 to really focus on not going after the attribution, but really looking at the tactics that the adversary was leveraging in cloud environments. We were making sure that we were reversing those tactics into best practices that could be consumed by managers of those cloud and managed service environments, as well as hoping that those providers would give real accurate read into the clients about the risk that they have in cloud. And if you remember, cloud is a very easy thing to roll off the tongue today. We see it in the largest of enterprises leveraging that kind of environment. 5-6 years ago, we were still talking about whether we get more security, less security, what do we need to do to manage as a client our responsibilities and security requirements, how do we do threat coordination. And again, I think in December 2018, with putting a face on China, but China in cloud environments, leveraging the sort of marketplace that they represented, meaning you have a number of client environments sitting alongside one another in a cloud environment. You've got technology, companies looking at future innovation. You've got a lot of healthcare and record management playing out in cloud environments. You've got next generation intellectual property in a number of areas. You have critical manufacturing supply chains overlaid in cloud environments. So for an adversary, it's a very target-rich environment of opportunity. And again, we focused for 4 years on, we're seeing this encroachment, we're seeing these types of persistent threat activities. And I think that, what we were doing is eventually building a bridge to the intelligence apparatus that the United States has, along with international partners, to say, okay, we finally understand who is behind that, which should indicate to you the sort of the sophistication that we've been telling you about all along, but it really hasn't changed what we said for 4 years, which is pay attention to your responsibilities as a provider, pay attention to your responsibilities as a client, come together and talk about how you want to navigate incident response of that environment, security provisioning. And so I guess my takeaway is that as we looked at, this 4-year kind of, how to roll that up, CISA was really trying to say through a number of webinars in late December 2018 and all through 19, this is the type of sophistication, this is the type of long game that adversaries have in cybersecurity. And so when we say advanced persistent threat, we don't just mean persistence once they've attacked you and got a foothold in your environment. There's certainly a side of persistence we see there. I think what we're talking about is folks like China, which has multiple 5-year plans and strategies for what they see in terms of strategic gains in terms of cybersecurity, as a way to get into different industries and support national outcomes and goals for them. they're taking a persistent long view of this, a slow burn, and they will watch our changes in the environment, and they will adjust to those changes, like the march of industry and government towards cloud environments. And keep that in mind. I'm going to come back to this idea of bad guys following the changes. So where you saw us on point in December 18 was really trying to look back at all of these advisories, alerts, technical bulletins, best practice documents over the course of 4 years, and finally giving people the 50,000-foot view of what that all means as a sum total package of how the adversary is going after these environments. I'll pivot to another quick example. In January 2019, as you remember, some of the federal government was out on a funding hiatus because of a lapse in congressional funding. And at the same time, we had to keep, bad guys don't take a holiday. They don't recognize funding hiatuses. And so late in December of 2018, early in January 2019, we saw some very interesting attacks against the domain name service infrastructure. So, if you and I want to trust the internet, we've got to trust that packets get routed and names get resolved so we can find the lookup services, if you will, to find the right website, to find the right services. So when we're talking about DNS tampering, we're talking about things that should rattle our trust in the core of internet services. And what we saw was sort of a trifecta of things. We saw bad guys, international actors go after domain name services, compromise the registration of how those IP addresses get resolved into names, and therefore they could change the way in which your www.google.com lookup goes to a Google server. Now, Google's not the example here. It was actually about ministries of security overseas and the relationship that those departments of state, if you will, in other countries were doing mail exchange with each other. And the bad guys here, in compromising DNS, could actually compromise where that mail was sent, because they can compromise some of the basic directory lookup that the internet relies upon. And so I guess my key point would be that sometimes you can't see the entire space of what the actor's up to. It's not just enough that they changed the domain registrations for lookup on the internet and how that kind of 411 process works. It was the fact that they were leveraging virtual private service environments. So imagine you're a hosting company and you see somebody say, I need some servers, I want to host a website, an email server, and but I only want it for a week worth of time, and then I want to close down that virtual environment, and I want to stand up another one as another storefront in another area of the service that you're providing. So a quick way to understand that in a layman's terms is, imagine I'm a bad actor and I co-opt the way in which your post office box is routing mail to me, and I have it sent to me at an apartment in a micro rental hotel that I can rent for 24 hours, and then I can change rooms, go to another hotel and set it up and receive all of your inbound mail, because again, I've compromised the way in which the directory services happen. Then imagine that, hey, we've all invested in this web of trust with TLS and secure socket layer services. So the fact that the mail's being delivered to me in my hotel room or the place that you're not expecting, you're going to be suspicious about that technologically, or at least the systems are very suspicious of that. Handshake not happening, where security is actually being done at a layer, at the application layer. And sorry to go technical here for a second, I'll get this to a layperson's example, but imagine that you asked to see my ID as I answer the door to receive that mail. And this is exactly what we saw. We saw three parts of the stool come together in this attack. We saw DNS tampering. We saw people set up these micro rentals to receive the web and email traffic. And we saw somebody compromise the way in which the ID was taken and trusted by the people who thought they were sending it to the right place. So this DNS tampering that we talked about, that we saw overseas and with our Department of State and some federal agencies, really meant that we didn't, I guess my point about this would be, you can't just appraise alone all the things that are going on to get the entire risk landscape well known. So So my takeaway would be that we had to stitch together with threat providers, domain name service providers around the globe, different countries, cyber emergency response teams. We had to look at the virtual private server environment, the hosting companies out there. We had to look at certificate authorities. We had to have all of them tell us whether we were seeing the totality of attacks on that DNS tampering. And when we felt not so confident about that we understood the full space, we reached out and created new partners. And that's one of my jobs, is to make sure that if you're not a partner of ours today and you've got something that contributes to the risk picture, the threat understanding, the vulnerability understanding of what's going on, I push that chair out. I go find you and tap you into our subject matter experts so we can get a full level set as a community. I think how we worked that was, right, creating outreach mechanisms, doing just-in-time sort of networks of new partners, and then being able to bring it back again on emergency directives, which is our federal agency, EASE way of saying that we were going to take certain action to improve the best practices so that these compromises couldn't happen, even if we didn't understand the totality of where these compromises were occurring. And it's not just enough to have you recognize or have the community say, oh, look what the federal government did. It stood up CMMC for future acquisitions. It put an emergency directive out on DNS. My job, along with you, is to read you in and say, here's why we did that. Here's how we appraise the risk. Here's why we're taking that action. Here's the window of time we think we have to take these actions to bolster the security the best practices that weren't in place yesterday that need in place today. And so again, I think it was a great example of where you just can't see, you're at the bottom of a well, you're looking up, you just can't see the full picture without industry, government, international partners sort of stitched to the hip. So now I would fast forward you really quickly, because I know I want to reserve time for questions, to some of what happened in this year, which is Iran happened early in this year with the assassination bombing, if you will, of General Soleimani in Iraq, Iran general, if you remember. And I guess my point there is that when we looked at the cyber implications of that episode, what we recognize as sort of a key takeaway is that sometimes the actors' behaviors one day, that is Iran's capabilities in cyber warfare, are likely to change in their tactics and what they've done based on other kind of stressors like what happened on January 8th of this year. And so what that means for you as a defender community is that everything you understood about Iran the day before might change on January 9th or 10th, the day after that kind of episode. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at Iran's capabilities, say last summer at this time. They were under sanctions. They were using ransomware to monetize a way around those sanctions. They were doing things in the Middle Eastern region against places like Saudi Arabia and the oil and natural gas capabilities of that country. They were doing destructive malware attacks. They were not doing that to the US. They were not leveraging more than sort of ransomware with us at that time. But they had this intentionality and capability and demonstration of capabilities in a smaller regional kind of footprint within the Middle East. So as folks, as defenders in the US kind of woke up to the news on January 9th of this year, what they heard was, we have, bombed an Iranian general in Iraq and outside the airport. Iran is likely not to go military on military in a proportional response. They're likely to shoot right past our military apparatus and come right to critical infrastructure in the United States and, start to work in the first 30 days with proxy and sympathetic actors who are going to do website defacements, hacktivism. And as the Iran sits back and says, what is a measured response for this? They realize, again, they're not going to lob maybe missiles and go, jet on jet, military on military. They're likely to use cyber weapons as part of their retaliation. So my job was, let's get the community together, critical infrastructure. Let's understand what has changed. let's see if any of the dynamics and what we see on the networks and the way we're defending have changed from one moment in time to another. And if you imagine what I think you understand from sort of classic military movies, is that odd behaviors happen or observable behaviors happen right before retaliation or response. So just like insider threats, and I know I'm kind of dancing around here, but with retaliation, whether it's insider threats or nation state actors, sometimes what they don't do in those first moments as they consider their response is just as telling to us as network defenders. And so what we expected was if Iran did have a foothold into networks, persistent access like China had into managed service environments, that maybe they would test the connection to those access points to be able to bring destructive malicious code or malware, that they would change their tactics to look at destroying infrastructure versus just monetizing it through ransomware events. And so again, my job was to make sure that we put out the notice that we're likely to see change behaviors here, and make sure that the partnership environment really worked, so that, you know, if we saw less signal amongst the noise that was Iran's cyber capabilities, we could actually look at that as a community and say, okay, they have dropped off some of their ransomware attacks. They are thinking about how they have pre-positioned access compromises so they can drop in things that will be destructive. And so finally, I would bring you to the current day, which is COVID. And COVID is predominantly a medical and a healthcare, public health, and you know, it's certainly something that as a pandemic is shaking every corner of society. But I would actually draw your attention to the bad guys in cyber have recognized this digital transformation driven by COVID and the way we work. And what they've really got is, as we stare ahead at the fire of the pandemic, if you will, and our eyes are all focused on our displaced workforces, our changed supply chain environments, our way in which we're rolling out new electronic government and industry services, the bad actors are following those changes and they're looking to monetize it. They're recognizing the changed attack surface is now in the home environment. They know that these remote workforce technologies like we're using today to do this summit, these are the things in which how we're getting business done. And they recognize that through denial of service, through weaponizing ransomware, through phishing attacks and fraud, they are going to follow this surface and they are going to get their pound of flesh out of us or the money that they want. So we're responding by making sure that securing the telework, securing remote work, securing this digital transformation is something that is community informed, so that we have a really good understanding of vulnerabilities and how they're changing, how the technical vulnerability or the organizational vulnerability right now exposes us in terms of critical infrastructure resilience issues to these changing trends. Since March 12th, I've been holding weekly, if not bi-weekly calls with critical infrastructure. Back on March 12th, we had 9,900 people on some of our nationwide calls. And my job as the stakeholder engagement lead for this agency is to read you into what's going on the non-medical side of COVID. So how is supply chain being disrupted? How might cyber attack and cyber adversaries sort of leverage that? What are we seeing in this digital transformation into a telenation of workers? And how might the bad guys monetize and attack that surface? And I think what's layered underneath that is we're continuing to push out the traditional technical vulnerability bulletins, the malware analysis, putting a name on threat actors and what their motivations are. But when you pull back, you can really see that it's really about infrastructure resilience. It's about governments and local governments and federal governments under stress, and how we're going to counteract that and sort of compensate for this new risk environment that we're in, driven by digital transformation. So, you know, certainly if you've taken anything from this, you know, I think there's no better time to partner with us in the federal sphere. And that's not just CISA, that's with your law enforcement, federal law enforcement partners. It's with the NIST and the FCC kind of partners out there. It's with the Small Business Association. There are a lot of anchor points for cybersecurity. If you're unsure where to anchor into, we want to help you there. And by the way, there's not just a federal answer here. You've got a great partnership in ITPA. You've got great associations out there and information sharing analysis centers, the ISECs. So that's my first takeaway is, you know, it's no better time to join a partnership. And I guess the flip side is takeaway two. What I've talked about is the so what now factor. That's so what is, what's the technical and the threat reality. The what now is, how do we come together as a community and drive shields up and a common set of defenses, and how do we work the problem as a community? I think you're looking at your networks, your change transformation, and you're saying, here's how I think we have new risk indicators, we have new sort of challenges in front of us. We don't know that. We don't know, we're not omniscient. We do not know what you know. And so I think to be in the fight with you, as you're reading how the calculus has changed for you as a defender, we need to understand and appraise this and to what I think Daniel talked about with a sense of how does that affect national critical functions, the basic underpinnings of national security, public safety, and continuity of the economy. And the third takeaway is, you know, don't forget your role as a mentor and a coach in all of this. COVID, where I close down my calls every week is, you know, there is a real need for continued education and mentoring. And quite frankly, part of that mentoring is to sound off on what is working under COVID, what is working on transformation, what is working as a defender. And I think, you know, there's a lot of small businesses out there, a lot of local governments under stress right now. You know more than they do. And, you know, you can help them by being a good coach, a good mentor, and making sure that if we're talking about things at too low of a level of detail where there's sort of expertise required, you can provide those translation services to them. That's something that we want to do is out of everything we see with the community, we want to take those insights and we want to pivot those so that they're not just good for government to know and say, yep, we absolutely understand the threats here. We understand what we have to do. It's how do we pivot that action to the digital divide that we see, which is small businesses, local governments under stress, not having cybersecurity capabilities that are built into the way they work. And I think there's a real good opportunity here for the community at large to become that mentor and kind of coach. So with that, Thelma, that's kind of my opening thoughts. And I know there's questions to get to, so I can't wait to tackle them with you and with the audience.
Absolutely. Director Wilkie, thank you so much for those dynamic and enlightening comments. It's hard to believe that we're already approaching the last 30 minutes of our session today, and we have an abundance of questions, all of which we will not be able to get to, but I will try to get to as many as we possibly can. This first question comes from one of our government partners, and it's asking that you discuss the agency's stakeholder engagement role as the front door to CISA.
Yeah, so I think you heard Rick Driggers talking about, you know, we do cyber exercises, like Cyberstorm is coming up this year. It's a big sort of stitched together community of putting people in trial mode before there's a real world event. And so we want to exercise and train. He probably talked about training that we do in industrial control system cybersecurity. I'm sure he talked about some of the things that we do as a incident coordinator when people do have cyber attacks and they need to understand, you know, what is that actor's capability as I see it playing out on my network? How long might they have been there? What kind of weapons and tools did they bring, and what should I be looking for? He probably also talked about the number of assessments that we do, whether it's vulnerability scanning, or it's pen tests, or it is looking at industrial control system environment. My point is that, you know, you shouldn't have to understand the apparatus of our cybersecurity division. You shouldn't have to understand the way in which we are organized as an agency in order to participate with us. So my job is to make sure that the service catalog that we have, and I know that sounds wonky, it sounds like we're a commercial enterprise, but the sales that we want with you because of your taxpayer funding of our agency, I want that information to come back to you so you know exactly where you can start on the map with us, and basically how you can get, you know, level set with us through training, exercises, assessments, information sharing, threat coordination, and also, you know, those are services, right? Incident response is a service. Providing you an assessment is a service. Partnership is also a service. And I know we keep using the software as a service, platforms as a service. I'm trying to convince you that partnership is the service model that I offer. And so we have very formal mechanisms and informal mechanisms. Some of the formal mechanisms are, there are 16 critical infrastructure sectors. There is a government coordinating council and a sector industry-led coordinating council for each of those 16 sectors and a myriad of subsectors. If you want to join us in the policy discussion, if you want to join us on community capacity building, if you want to join us on how threat information sharing gets better, if you want to do exercises with us, sometimes those formal mechanisms, they tell us exactly where to steer our strategic priorities over years worth of time, not just in response to your demand for services or intelligence, which has to happen day to day. So my job in offering a front door is to make sure that CISA is accessible to you, it's accountable to you, it provides services that you need, it points you at where we're not good at things and where we are, and it allows you to have formal partnership with us. It's one thing to invite you to a drop everything call on a Microsoft DNS vulnerability like I did 2 days ago, or where we talked about SAP's new NetWeaver vulnerability, and we tried to convince the community that this was something to sort of put down the coffee mug if you're a technocrat and really pay attention to, because here's what we think the seriousness means to a supply chain, warehousing, logistics, and enterprises as they use those kind of systems. So my job is to make sure that you've got a chair at the table as a partner, as well as take advantage of the services that move you from maybe a newer organization to cybersecurity to somebody who's fully committed with us and really transactionally related to us in terms of threat coordination, information sharing, and a commitment to share with us when you see breaches, attacks, and compromises. You have an outlet, even if you've got the best cyber defender response capabilities. Sharing that information gives us a bigger view of the landscape. So that's the front door I'm talking about. And that's the cyber example, but I'm the front door for the rest of CISA as well.
That's a big job being the front door.
Yeah, what I was going to say is it is not just me. I've got to stitch together folks, but whether it's me answering a 1-800 number, which it's not, but those are the types of things we're trying to provide, which is, as a service organization, you've got to know how to get our attention, how to make inquiries, how to get requests for information as well as services, and what kind of partnership opportunities we've got. So I will make that as seamless and transparent and as accountable as it needs to be. Sorry, Thelma, you were gonna, I think, next question.
Yes, from me. CISA's core goals are defend today and secure tomorrow. So can you expand a little bit on securing tomorrow?
Yeah, I think a great example is 5G and industrial control. And I would say that industrial control system operations technology has always been there. 20, 30 years we have seen enterprise technology doing the work in manufacturing, transportation, along with these very specific engineered systems that are doing water treatment, energy management. I think the secure tomorrow is that we have just continued to see integration into the internet of industrial operations technology. So industrial IoT is a good example. The Internet of Things is making all of that operations technology landscape visible to the world, or at least sometimes visible to the adversaries, a higher online presence. Even the people that we're using that have been sort of, let's take water treatment or manufacturing. Even the people that have no exposure to the internet of their industrial control process probably had, ability to monitor those systems and have sort of remote access for that. They've also looked at, the cloud environment as a way for fast tracking continuity and recovery aspects of operations technology. So the point is that operation technology has been there, but the threat and the attack surface landscape has changed. The amount of things that are becoming sort of network aware that are in operations technology has changed. And I think what we're doing is we're reappraising our view of tomorrow's smart city is going to be a whole intersection of communications networks like 5G. It's going to be interaction with devices that are very non-traditional. They are not the laptop and the phone and the desktop environment and the server environment that we're used to. It really is an era of an Internet of Things, and really more towards industrial Internet of Things. We're seeing this in warehousing, logistics, transportation. Smart everything is kind of the moniker of the day. And so we're chasing that as an adage of secure tomorrow. I also think that there are lots of technologies, 5G being one of those, AI, quantum, where these are great new opportunities when it comes to economic prosperity, intellectual property, doing a lot more through automation. And yet, I think what we've got is, we know the technology that's going to be delivering that. We don't always understand the application to critical infrastructure, to how that's going to change the American average citizen's way of interacting with technology. So the secure tomorrow has to project that risk environment that we don't fully understand because it's not in place today. And it has to do, I think, more of what your panel was talking about. The aspiration of CMMC, for example, is about making sure that we can rise to the assurance case, making sure that we have a common set of capability and maturity features across an entire ecosystem, like a supply chain or a product chain. So as we think about smart cities, all that technology intersects the citizen with their technology. The environment has awareness of new devices entering. You've got smart transportation systems, which are really highly interactive with the communications environment. And I think we don't want to wait to find out what the risk is after we've deployed that. We need to, not bolt on, but build in. So I think, assurance cases, making sure that kind of landscape is forecast, we understand the application of those things, and we get ahead of the curve a little bit. That's a big part of the landscape of secure tomorrow.
Thank you. One of our industry attendees is asking if you would discuss CISA's strategic intent document.
Yeah, so most agencies have a set of strategic priorities, and yet if you read things like the National Plan for Cybersecurity, national strategies for things like intelligence, and the worldwide threat assessments, you don't always understand what agency is on point to do what parts of threat mitigation, vulnerability management, consequence management, and recovery. So this was our way of sort of projecting that the director, our first director of the agency, right? We're a new independent agency within the Homeland Security enterprise, has 5 strategic priorities. Those really cut across that defend today, secure tomorrow. So elections being one of those operational priorities, countering 5G and global supply chain risk is another one, generally with a face of China on it, because that's the sort of high watermark we strive to when we're thinking about countering bad actors manipulating 5G and supply chain. Soft targets in crowded places is another strategic priority of ours. If you look at what's happening in Europe, which is now translating to Charlottesville and other places, the bad guys understand the horrific, consequences that they can create through vehicle ramming and explosive devices, and the sort of vulnerability that we have in our crowded places, mass gathering kind of environments. We're focused on industrial systems, as I mentioned, and therefore operations technology. And we're focused on what we've been good at for 2 decades, which is protecting the federal .gov environment. So I talked about DNS tampering and what we do there, but as we move to be more sophisticated and we follow industry's best practices in a lot of cases to do that, we are trying to make sure that local government, state government, territorial government, tribal government is taking the best of our lessons defending 99 departments and agencies at the federal level and translating those into investment, leadership, and best practice opportunities within industry and within state, local, territorial, and tribal and international partners. So I guess my point here would be that the strategic priorities are one half those operational priorities, and then the other half of how are we going to go and affect those kind of changes? how are we going to invite you into the read-in of how we see risk against those strategic priorities? How do we need folks to look at, drones and unmanned aerial systems as it goes to crowded places, soft target security? How do we look at school safety and the school shootings in the context of mass gathering places where we send all of our children, including my 10-year-old and my now 6th grader? So, being on point with you, and the strategic intent was to describe, here's where we're investing our calories in these strategic risk priorities, but here's also the way in which we want to work with you, because we need you to share in the means and the methods about how we're going to go work that as a community. And so I think Daniel probably had the best translation, which is after those 5 priorities, each one of you probably doesn't put those equally on your radar as a high priority. You probably have a myriad of other enterprise level risk targets and again, tolerance and insensitivity to certain types of risk that we need to put on our radar and work as well. So the whole adage of national critical functions is part of that strategic intent, is to hold out there 55 essential to the continuity of the economy, national security, public safety, critical infrastructure resilience, and say, as the risk barometer changes, there is stakeholders that need to be convened, there is mitigations that need to be taken as a community, there is a gap of acceptance maybe or transference of risk, and it's just inviting that kind of risk conversation. So the strategic intent really lays out the way in which we want to work, and exactly, open kimono, if you will, exactly how we're going to work with you and what we do and what we don't know as part of that methodology that will be risk-based, evidence-based, and really drive towards those community outcomes. So I know that sounds very much pie in the sky, but I encourage everybody to go back and read that document. It really lays out, whether you agree with those priorities or not, it lays out how we want to work this risk-based environment. And again, it is the community that has to bring us the totality of how our understanding will change, and the what's working versus what's not, what the gaps are. So that's a little bit of what's in that document.
So that's a great segue to talk a little bit more in depth about risk. What are CISA's risk management priorities, and can you discuss the discipline of measuring and managing risk?
Yeah, sure. So I think Daniel laid this out pretty clear this morning. I think, again, I would go back to this concept of national critical functions. Let's look at things like global wholesale payments and the way in which financial institutions are, exchanging global receipts, if you will, between large financial markets and financial institutions. When you unpack that, what we find is that there is, large players, right? You're going to find Bank of America has touched 4 out of 5 Americans in the US. You've got JP Morgan Chase, you've got all of the markets and the large financial institutions. And when we look at their ability to mitigate risks against some of these national critical functions, they alone cannot appraise systemic risk, which is risk that is shared in the environment, but which can't be mitigated through one unique actor. The CISA cannot solve this problem. Bank of America alone, JP Morgan, Bank of New York Mellon cannot appraise the entire space of risk, let alone bring the mitigations, because of how these are really, that's what's unpacked in that national critical functions thing. It is a number of independent contributions that provide something like the food supply chain, that provide and demonstrate elections, right? 50 states, 3,000 jurisdictions participate in the elections. Our job is to make sure that we draw enough people together, and elections is a really good one because that's our 5th operational priority. And we bring people who are, they're telling us about the system perspective of how elections get done. They're telling us about the environment, which is available to fraud or it's available to manipulation. They're telling us about the protective measures, the age of systems, the relationship that they have with vendors and manufacturers of those key electronic technologies like voter registration databases on one end, electronic poll books and you know, the voting machine on the other side, the tabulation and the projection of actual voting results down the middle. And so if we're not getting the community together to look at the totality of the elections process, then we don't have, you know, secretaries of state, their chief information security officers and chief information officers on point. We don't have the vendor and manufacturers. We don't have the people looking at nation state threat actor capabilities to be able to have manipulations or just create disinformation there, which is a big part of the elections thing, is just projecting that there should be high confidence in our elections process. It does have a lot of, you know, redundancy built into it. But my point is that is a great demonstration of where CISA has tried to say, look, the risk is not just what we say it is. There's not just trust because we're telling you it's a strong elections process. We have brought together every, you know, every person with a risk perspective, with an equity here as a stakeholder. And they are telling us that here's this, yes, this is the space of risk. Yes, it's going to be challenging here with paper ballots or these types of non-direct direct record, you know, systems which don't keep paper receipts as to the vote. So we know where challenges are, we know where the vulnerabilities are, and we can work on those things. And we've been pretty deliberate with that since some of our, you know, missed opportunities around 2016 that I think we've learned in the last 4 years. So that entire process of unpacking, you know, elections and as a demonstration of, you know, American democratic principles, right? As a national critical function, right? It certainly is a stressor that we've all felt in terms of trust in government, trust in, you know, the ability to dissuade international parties from manipulating our elections. Can we get to look under every stone for disinformation and actual attacks? And my point is, as we approach that, we have to approach it at a risk perspective. You got to stitch in all the partners. You got to torque down on the gaps, and you've got to get education out there to the American public about, you know, their role in participating in the elections process, which I think is an equivalent second side of the coin to all the things that we're doing with secretaries of state, the Federal Elections Commission, our own election security initiative. It's not just about trying to actually take away the risk, it's trying to project all of that information so that the American public has confidence in it. So that's the risk process that we have. And I would apply that to, you know, as we see pipeline security risk, as we see risk from nation states in cloud environments, we start with that same sort of risk framing, draw together people that get us an accurate picture of where the needle is on the risk measurements. They tell us what they have to contribute to the fight in terms of mitigations, where they're winning, where they're leading high performers, and where we still have room to move. And then we need to be able to stitch the intelligence apparatus to say, okay, you're actually making a really good, credible appraisal of risk, or here's what our intelligence community is telling us about the capabilities of adversaries and actors. And so that may change the way in which you're looking at your ability to say you've mitigated that risk to your satisfaction. So again, this is one where elections, pipeline security, the federal government cannot just say, we understand the risk and we're going to dictate exactly, we've signed the remit that says, don't worry, we've got this. This is about, again, the community of defenders writ large, stitching together that picture of risk and then coming out with joint effort, you know, unity of effort, unity of messaging, unity of coordination. A good example of that in a very small scale, Thelma and ITPA audience, is that with elections like we saw in the primary season, it's not just about looking at the large risk landscape, it's about being there moment to moment as those elections are happening and putting the defenders, the manufacturers into situational awareness rooms, literal virtual environments where they can chase down leads of maybe false positives, but indicators of bad actor activities, indicators of system failures that may be attributed to an attack. And so we are running down as a snapped at the hip community, not just this pedagogical on high, believe us, the risk is accounted for now that we've talked to all the secretaries of state and their chief information security officers, but actually moving that to a tactical operational relationship in the moments before, during, and after those elections to preserve what we understand about how we're being attacked if we are, how to actually mitigate it, what this means in terms of compensating measures as we make those votes, as secretaries of state are certifying those results. So, this is again, a risk management process that can be now applied in a number of different risk contexts and examples.
Okay. I think we may have time for just 2 more questions. We've got one coming in from one of our Department of Defense participants today, asking about the collaboration between CISA's Information Communications Technology Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force and the DoD's CMMC. They're asking, why does it matter?
Why does the cooperation matter, or why does it matter that we do different sides
I think
of the
it's
coin?
why does the collaboration matter?
Yeah, I've been around the federal government for 25 years now. I probably have the answer that's sort of the patent answer, which is, the way in which defense, I think, with all of its power of the purse and its defense federal acquisition requirements versus the federal acquisition requirements that have with their GSA and some of the work that we do, right? I think, one, the collaboration matters because of the power of the purse that the DoD has to influence effects in the supply chain environment and in, extended risk ecosystem. So what CMMC is trying to tackle. So, the Federal Acquisition Act requirements, the executive orders have really required us to say, look, if the federal government is trying to lead the charge on getting more assurance, capability, maturity, more acumen, if you will, built into the way in which it's investing in to provide weapon systems and intelligence services and military services, we should be able to make the same translation as government goes to procure for 99 significant federal departments and agencies. And so the work of the Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force is not wholly undifferent than it is what the DoD is doing. And so I think it's just parity. The basic answer is, we need to keep a pace with the best lessons and demonstrations of requirements under federal acquisition, regardless of whether they're towards a weapon system or towards a high assurance, high valued asset that we have on the federal.gov side. The other point I think that the supply chain risk management tackles is, we cannot go out in there and dictate in industry when it's not procuring things or working as an acquisition provider or an acquired provider for government. We're not going to go dictate terms to how industry does its supply chain management. But what we can do is say, here's the lessons we've learned. Here's what we think it takes to appraise foreign influence in supply chains. Here's what we think it means to have an understanding of how the supply chain is managed versus what is actually produced in the supply chain that is free from manipulation because of best practices built in to the whole chain of suppliers, manufacturers, and the midstream, the first person building a widget, delivering something that is a very multi-sourced product at the end of the day, or a service. So whether that's code and a software build of materials, or that's a product as a weapon system and lots of components coming together through different manufacturers and suppliers, I think what we're trying to do is say there is a translation for the federal government itself or at large outside of the DoD. There's a translation for state and local government to assist them in the high performance practices. And there is something about demonstrating with industry that we recognize that they also have a common space of challenges, but that regulation is not going to answer it because they're just, they're not held to those standards. So my whole point here is that hopefully what you're seeing in the ICT SCRIM, the Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force, the work of the FASC for federal acquisition, the work of the DFAR and the CMMC is closely coordinated, where we look at the most sensitive of systems in a military context. we make those best practices now available for people considering federal acquisition, like the GSA just did through one of its major acquisition contracts, and said, look, pay attention to the CMMC and start to get a game plan for how you might address some of the maturity measures and responsibilities under that framework. And then, we go back to industry and say, hey, for those who are not required to have these acquisition, built into your acquisition, these security kind of models, what do you think is the gap here? What are you doing in your industry area or with your global suppliers in terms of best practices? So it is absolutely more about the collaboration than, and it is somewhat about the parity of just making sure that if what's good for the goose in the DoD apparatus is really good for the gander, if you will, in the federal area. So Thelma, I think that might have wrapped up our time, but sorry to be long-winded there, but it's a very important apparatus, and I think again it's how we're putting different stakeholder sets at the table to get a big picture of DoD, federal space, and industry. As we get smarter about acquiring systems, building systems, and managing supply chains.
So thank you so much. This has been such a great engagement. And we'd like to thank everyone for their feedback and for the positive feedback. And we'll be following up with the remaining questions after today's webinar concludes. I'm just sorry that we didn't have enough time to address all of them. Thank you, Director Wilkie, for your insightful comments on the challenging and evolving cyber threat landscape, the importance of partnerships, and CISA's key role in cyberspace. The audience is joining me in a virtual, resounding round of applause for your time and your comments today. Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much. Happy to be back with you sometime, and I love to see the great work that ITPA and Electrosoft is doing, so keep it up, and you're part of the community. If you don't have a chair at the table, let me know how I can push it out for you. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I'd like to invite Manuel Miranda to offer some closing remarks.
Thank you, Thelma, and hopefully everybody can hear me well. This is my second conference that I attended, this time as a participant, and I've been both times pleasantly surprised by how engaging and informative our speakers are through the virtual lens. So it was another great summit. I took copious notes, but here are a few highlights that really stuck out to me. Of course, Daniel Cruz, what stuck out to me from there was how CISA is looking at the critical infrastructure in a holistic manner and protecting our nation's critical infrastructure. Also, the importance of supplier chain management, risk management is critical. And I enjoyed the story that he told about how CISA took on Kaspersky Labs and successfully defended that in court, and at the same time actually had developed the rigor of a third-party assessment. That was a very interesting story. And finally, from his talk, the importance of partnership with public and private on cybersecurity, which is really a team sport. In the panel discussion, which was fantastic, lots and lots of good information. Certainly COVID impacts came out front and center. It was really interesting to look at how, the world has changed and we're working from home and actually everywhere, but how that has opened us up to interesting threats. I never thought about IoT and how it potentially is listening to what we're doing, and how our home networks are potentially exposed to intrusion threats. And even as simple a thing as when you do a printout, how do you get rid of the printout when you're not at the work? It really made me think that we're in the front line, really, from our homes and wherever we are in the front line of cybersecurity. Also in the panel discussion, it was interesting to look at the team approach in cybersecurity. The team is really a big part of it, that it's not just the cybersecurity professionals, but it's all of us who have a role in protecting our organizations. And I love this, and I don't know if I correctly got the entire quote, but I love the quote, "We are monitoring the threats we see and address them, while our adversaries are looking at the new threats they are developing." That really struck home to me, and about looking at future threats and keeping up with the adversaries out there in the world. And of course, the ITPA members and their responsibility to cybersecurity threats. They are a governed industry. And finally, with Bradford Wilkie, it was really interesting to hear about COVID again and how the bad guys see opportunity. They're following the change and the new tools that we're using, even the new tool we're using today to do this conference. So very interesting comment there. And also that there's no better time for a partnership with government resources like CISA and the local government. And of course, our common responsibility to be both mentors and listeners to all of the information that's out there and doing that. And I think the one common theme for the entire thing is partnership, the COVID impact. Everyone has a role in security, and we are the front line to security, whether we're at home or at work. And Electrosoft joins in thanking CISA, Daniel Cruz, Bradford Wilkie, and our distinguished panelists, Kevin R. Cook Jr., Larry Hale, Jesse Showers, Rear Admiral David Simpson, Nathia Rachamukuda, and our moderator, Nicole Johnson, for a lively and informative discussion. And our appreciation to our media friends for supporting today's event. Thank you also to our generous corporate sponsors, Calvio Federal, Comcast Business, CommScope, Synergicom Solutions, and Foxhole Technologies. And virtual applause to our MC, Thelma Baker, and the great ITPA organization for their spirit of collaboration and teamwork. And now back to you, Thelma.
Thank you, and appreciation to you, Manuel, and to Electrosoft for the tremendous show of cooperation and support on this second in a series, Electrosoft ITPA NCC Joint Cyber Program. And appreciation to our attendees for taking a few moments before you log off to give us some feedback as we strive to continually improve. As mentioned previously, the link for this session will be available for your viewing pleasure following today's webinar. And a reminder, in case you missed our first webinar, the video is available on demand on our ITPANCC.org website. Thank you to the ITPA NCC sponsors, Avaya Government Solutions, BT, CenturyLink Government, Corning, Crown Castle, Graybar, and Mettel. And congratulations again to our outgoing ITPA NCC President, Denny Grow. ITPA NCC will continue to hold an array of virtual events throughout 2020. Stay tuned for program updates and mark your calendar for ITPA's annual charity golf tournament on Monday, November 2nd at the Army-Navy Country Club in Fairfax. More information is found at info@itpancc.org. Thank you again to our speakers, sponsors, and all of our special attendees. Thank you for joining us today. Stay safe and have a great day.